So firstly, we received 100 followers on Instagram, and we have everyone here in this call to thank for that. So we really wanted to say a big thank you to everyone by offering a giveaway. This giveaway features the opportunity to get a free personal statement review and a Q&A session with our Oxford and Imperial Med students about absolutely any part of your application. To be eligible for the giveaway, we just ask that you do 3 things for us: to join one of our WhatsApp group chats, to follow Edify Learning on Instagram, and then just to like and comment on each of our posts, tagging at least 3 other people in your comment. For every one of your people that you tag that follows us, you also receive an extra entry in your name. And we'll do this giveaway. We'll be drawing winners in 2 weeks, so we'll let you know as soon as possible. We're also close to completing our strategic application ebook for medicine. And essentially, what this means is that what this guide is for is that it will tell you all the UCAT cutoffs, all the BMAT cutoffs, and all the scores of applicants who applied to every single medical school last year for 2021 entry. And what we hope to do with this is to give you the information that you need to be able to look at your UCAT score, to look at your application, your predicted grade, and say, okay, I can comfortably apply to this university and know that I have a fairly good chance of getting in, or getting an interview, sorry. So when I saw a question earlier about how do I know if I've got a good UCAT strong for an application, how do I know if my UCAT score is strong for an application? We're going to try and release that as soon as possible. On that topic, we're also releasing free one-to-one strategic application consultations, where essentially one of us is going to go through your application with you, discuss with you about which university your application should be best for based on what you've scored, your personal statement, and all that. So do keep a lookout for that. Again, these are all free, so keep a lookout for those. Another thing to mention is on the topic of strategic applications, if you prefer video formats instead of like ebooks and consultations, then please visit someone called Ruler the Medic, who is currently working hard on some YouTube and Instagram videos about applying strategically to universities. She's received an offer from UCL, and she really knows a lot about the admission cycle in general. So she's a great, friendly, and reliable source of information that you can contact if you want more information about strategic application. Then, as we approach the start of the academic year again, we'll be opening up live A-level maths, biology, chemistry, and physics lessons to help cover areas that you may want more help in for future mocks and so on. But if you're not a fan of the A-level group sessions, then we'll also be offering one-to-one paid tuition as well, where you have like a more opportunity for direct and focused teaching. In response to one of the questions earlier, we are planning to run a free BMAT crash course as well this year in a very similar style, where we go through obviously exam content, questions, and worked examples. But we'll be basing it a lot on the feedback we get from this one. So if you're still here, then I'll talk about some more feedback later on, but for now, we'll just continue this one. And group interview practice. When in far future, when fingers crossed you all have your full offers, for interview invitations, we'll be preparing group interview practice tutorials where we'll be teaching skills for different formats of interviews. So that's MMI and panel interviews. And then you have a chance to practice these skills with us by asking questions, answering questions, and asking other applicants who are applying to similar universities as you. For all of these things we're planning on offering, you'll be able to find more information for them in the email you receive after today's presentation. So please feel free to have a further look there. If you're interested in any of the things that we're planning on offering soon, then please don't hesitate to get in contact with us. On the screen, you'll see our email, our Instagram, and our Facebook, which you can visit to stay updated with our different resources that we're offering soon. And although we're planning to release all our free ebooks on our website eventually, we just want to quickly point out that they will be exclusively available for our Instagram followers around a week or two before we release them publicly on our website. So if you'd like, you can follow us on Instagram to get this early access, and we tend to release most of our messages here anyway, so it's definitely worth to follow. And outside of these social media platforms, you can also get involved in our growing communities by joining our WhatsApp group chat for medicine and dentistry applicants. Here we've got lots of people. You'll be able to meet other applicants and share advice or news on your application, and everyone's more than welcome to join. Quite recently, we've got a lot of people just going through and talking about different tips and tricks that they're doing for the UCAT questions, as well as different examples that people need help on. So that's always there. And moreover, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to just rate our service provided today on Trustpilot, the link for which is currently on the screen. It really helps us grow as a business and provide more events like this because, as I said, it's our first time running stuff like this. So we really appreciate the feedback to know what we should do next time to make it better, what we did well this time, which essentially covers each of the 5 sections in the UCAT in a lot more detail. And these sections are the verbal reasoning, the decision making, the quantitative reasoning, the abstract reasoning, and the situational judgment. For each of these sections, we'll be looking at different question types that can come up, and it will cover some exam advice for how you can answer these. We'll also be working through some example questions so you can see some of the exam advice that we're mentioning being put into actual practice. And then towards the end of the session, depending on how much time we have available, we'll also try to have a short Q&A session where we answer any questions that you have. Consequently, if you do have any questions, then please try and save them for the Q&A at the end. However, if they're urgent questions, like if you have to go in the second half, then please feel free to type them in the chat and one of us will try to answer them for you whilst the presentation's ongoing. So with that said, let's begin by looking at the UCAT 2021 in general. So what is the UCAT? Well, essentially, the UCAT is a computerized admissions test that you'll have to take when you're applying for medicine and dentistry at some universities. For these universities, this UCAT exam essentially forms a key part of the admissions process. So it's important to always try and perform as well as you can to maximize the strength of your application. However, it's also important to note that each university will use your UCAT score differently, with some universities placing a lot greater weighting on the UCAT performance than others. As an exam, the UCAT is unique in the sense that it's more designed to test your aptitude rather than your academic ability, making it different from exams you might have taken before, like GCSEs. Specifically, you'll be tested on a range of skills and attributes that are considered important for health-based careers, and these are tested across the 5 different sections. So let's talk a bit about the format of the UCAT. It's a 2-hour test that you have to take on a computer, and essentially there are only going to be multiple choice style questions in each of the sections. You can only take the UCAT at Pearson VUE test centers, essentially where you might be more familiar with taking driving tests, but you'll have access to an online calculator, marker pens, and whiteboards to help you answer the questions at these venues. Moreover, if you actually require any further support or access arrangements for taking the UCAT, then you can find a lot of information about UCAT SEN and the UCAT bursary schemes available on the actual official UCAT website. So there's a wealth of information there if you need it, but for the purpose, we'll continue. Scoring of the UCAT. Now, when it comes to the scoring of the UCAT, it's very, very specific. There's a relatively strange method used, so to speak. For the first 4 sections, so that's the verbal reasoning, decision-making, quantitative reasoning, and abstract reasoning, you'll be awarded a score ranging from 300 to 900 based on the number of correct answers you select. And that in total gives you essentially a score from 1200 to 3600. Saying that, the mark scaling for these sections is not always linear. So sometimes you can achieve a maximum score of 900 without necessarily answering every single question correctly. You might miss one, but you can still get 900. For the final section, the situational judgment, you'll be awarded, rather than a numerical score, you'll be given a band, and that ranges from band 4 to band 1, depending on how accurate your selected answers are. So in this context, band 1 reflects the highest performance in the situational judgment, and band 4 reflects the lowest performance. We'll go into that a bit more detail later on when we talk about the situational judgment itself. But again, each of these UCAT scores are used differently by each medical school and dental school and application cycle. Some of them think that the UCAT score is really important and they have pretty high cutoffs for them, like Exeter last year had an over 3,000 UCAT cutoff, but others, they don't place that much of an importance in them and instead look for other parts of your application. So regardless, it's always important to try and apply strategically to the medical schools with your UCAT score. So for example, if you achieve a high UCAT score, then you should always try and apply for universities that value UCAT performance in the selection process. And this is all stuff we cover in a lot more detail in our strategic application ebook that we're currently working on. That will contain a lot more detailed information about cutoffs and applications in general, but like I said, it's something we're working on now and we'll plan to be releasing in the future. So keep an eye out for that. So that's the UCAT. Very quickly. Now we're going to look at a list of the universities that require to take the UCAT. So you can find this university list online. You can also find it in our UCAT ebook, which we're working on and we'll also release later on. But essentially, you can see that these universities, they require you to take the UCAT for medicine courses, and some of them also require you to take them for the dental courses. The UCAT is not only used for medicine, some dental schools require you to take them as well. So that's just a point to make right there. Yeah, again, you don't need to memorize any of this. If you know which university you'd like to apply to for UCAT, that's probably why you're taking it, but it's just for reference. Over here, we've got the key dates for the UCAT 2021 cycle. Again, you'll be able to find these online or in the ebook we're working on. but we won't linger too on them. Just an important note is to mention is that you can see probably that 26th of July is when testing began. So actually, UCAT testing has already begun. Some of you may have your UCAT exam very soon, and we hope that today's presentation will be helpful for that. Our advice is usually to take the UCAT during the summer break if possible, as early as you can before year 13 or your next year of school. And the main reason for this is because once you get back to school, you'll need to spend a lot of time, or you'll probably spend a lot of time preparing your actual UCAS application. And that includes writing your personal statement, getting references, and you may also be spending some time for school mocks for the BMAT if that's applicable to you. So ideally, you want to get the UCAT out of the way as early as possible. Yeah, here are the key dates. You do have a lot of time to take it. You can go into school time before you finish the UCAT deadline. But as you said, it's usually better to try and get it out of the way in summer. So the key dates done. Let's talk about the preparation for the UCAT. Now, this is one of the most important parts, namely because your personal preparation is essentially going to determine your score. Since it's an aptitude test and not an academic ability test, it's all about getting the practice in. And then there's three main bits about preparing for the UCAT that we want you to take into account when you do it. So firstly is timing. As most of you will probably know, the timing is incredibly strict on the UCAT, as in you're given a lot of questions and you're given very little time. And actually, that's the main reason why the UCAT is difficult. The questions in themselves, given enough time, most people would be able to do them. But because of the fact that you're given so little time, you end up making mistakes that you don't normally make when you answer questions, or you just might not be fast enough to read the questions yourself. So it's always important to try and manage your time well on the UCAT. We have three different approaches that might work for you. They might work as guidelines, but obviously take them with a pinch of salt. You should always use what you find best. So approach one is called using equal splits of time. So this is essentially dividing all the time up you have in each section into equal segments, depending on the question. So for example, in verbal reasoning, you have 44 questions and 11 minutes. Let's say you had 44 questions, 11 minutes, or 11 passages. You want to divide it so you have a quarter of your time is spent equally. In another example, let's say you have 22 questions and you have 22 minutes, essentially a minute for each question. So that's using equal splits. That kind of works because it's simple, but it's not the best one to use because in decision making, where you have lots of different types of questions, you'll tend to find that some questions you need to spend more time than others. So this linear approach, we don't really recommend it. Something that kind of makes use of this linear approach is called setting milestones. That's our second approach. This one is a lot better. It works in essentially, let's say you've got 44 questions to do, right? And you've got 20 minutes to do it. We'll say, okay, we want to get half of them done by 10 minutes. So you say in half the time, you want to get half the questions done. That way, you don't necessarily have to do every question with the same amount of time. You can just make sure that by the time you get to the halfway mark, you've done half the questions. And that really gives you a lot more flexibility with how much time you can spend on each question. The third approach is basing your time length on question difficulty. Now, this is quite difficult because you have to physically assign your time based on the questions there are. So you might waste time in that sense. But it helps because it means you spend a lot less time on the easy questions by trying to answer them as fast as possible. And you get a lot more time for the harder questions because they require more time. They need more calculations. They need more focus. And so by doing this more analytical approach, you tend to be able to get more marks. Again, these are all three approaches that we found useful. We use them in different ways, but whenever it comes to the UCAT, it's all about what works best for you. So timing wise, find what works best for you and stick to it. That's where you've got practice. That's where you've got to see what works best for you. So that leads us nicely to our next point, which is practice itself. When you complete your practice of the UCAT, we like to think of doing it in three main stages. So firstly, we've got the untimed stage. Then secondly, we've got the time stage. And then thirdly, we've got the mocks or the official mocks. So we like to say begin with untimed practice because that's essentially where you start to develop the techniques you like to use for each section. Without the time pressure, you get to really appreciate what type of questions come up, and you get to start to use methods you like better. So it's always good to start with untimed practice if you have the chance to work through questions. Don't give up on them. Try as hard as you can to get them right, and try and do it without looking at the answer first, because then you develop the problem-solving methods and skills that you need to answer those types of questions, essentially. Now, once you've done enough time practice to really refine your methods, you can start moving with the time practice. And this is when you have a massive jump up in difficulty. when you start doing time practice for the UCAT, you'll probably feel swamped, or you'll feel very stressed, because that time pressure adds a lot. It makes it a lot harder for you to do the UCAT well. You'll often find that you're now struggling to maybe even get half the section done. And that's fine. That's why you're practicing. It's all about making sure that you're practicing to be as best as you can on the actual test day. So if you might be thinking, if you don't perform well on the time mocks, you might not do well on the actual exam. Well, that's not the case, because this is why you're doing practice, so you can get better. So time practice, do as much of it as you can, really, as much of it as you can, because that's when you're under time pressure, you're in literally exam conditions. So that's really preparing you the best way. Now, once you've done enough time practice, you can move on to doing mocks. Now, mocks are probably the best practice you can do for the UCAT. Depending where you get them from, some are very similar to the actual mocks, some of them less so, but mocks in general are nice because they give you the full 2-hour experience, and then it's not just like doing one section, then another section, then another section, then another section. You're doing a full UCAT paper, and that whole experience where you only have a minute break between each section, that's important to get used to, because quite often when people do practice, they forget that when you do the actual exam, it's all 1 2-hour sitting, and that can be very tiring if you're not used to it. So mocks, if you get a chance, towards the end of your practice, you should be doing. So those 3 phases, untimed, timed, and mocks, you should be doing in that order as you approach your exam. So you might be wondering, where can you access these resources? Well, firstly, we think you should use the ones on the UCAT official website, because they're most likely to be like the ones that come up in the actual exam. So on the UCAT official website, you'll be able to find practice questions and practice mocks. Unfortunately, there aren't answers for them, but you get a real feel about how the difficulty of the questions that come up and how you should answer them. Outside of these resources, you might have seen things like Edify and Med Entry. Those are like online question banks with lots of tracking and mocks, and to be honest, we think they're useful. So they can be quite expensive for some people, but we think there are sort of bursary schemes that are available for you. So if you can, try and get an online question bank, simply because there's a lot of questions you can practice on. There's a lot of tracking you can do, and that really helps. And that tracking aspect, especially on Edify, really helps with the reflective practice, which we'll get on in a moment. But yeah, online question banks are probably your best friend when it comes to practicing, simply because how many resources there are and the facilities that are available for you to analyze your work. So the third most important bit about you preparing for the UCAT is reflection. So this links on from practice very well, but essentially reflection is making sure that your practice is completely worth it. So there's no point doing 10 hours of UCAT practice in one day if you're not going to learn for anything from it, if you're not going to reflect on it. I'd rather you do 2 hours of UCAT a day, but reflecting on it, and make sure you learn something from that experience. So what do we mean when we say reflection? We mean looking back at what you got right, what you got wrong, and trying to see why you got them right or wrong. So for example, I could do 20 verbal reasoning questions and get 4 of them wrong. Yeah, I got 16 of them right, but I'd rather look at the 4 I got wrong and see why I got them wrong. What you'll tend to find is that the questions that you get wrong usually are of similar types, and that gives you the chance to say, okay, well, maybe I should spend more time working on these types of questions and developing a method for these questions instead. Because while it's important you're getting questions right, another way of thinking about it is just trying to make sure you don't get questions wrong. That can sound confusing, but it's a different way of looking at your things, and just making sure that you're picking up on why you're not getting marks in some places and you're getting marks in others. Really organizing your practice and looking back at it, that's something that's very important when you're preparing for the UCAT. It just means that when you go moving forward with your practice, you know what you're doing, and it just doesn't mean you're blindly doing 5,000 questions over the next few months or something. So where possible, manage your timing, make sure you do practice with time, untimed, and mocks, and most importantly, make sure you're reflecting on your practice. But that's the general information I want to get about the UCAT out the way. With all that said, we can actually begin on some of the UCAT content. Now, the first section is, if we can get it up, the first section is verbal reasoning, right? So most of you will probably know this as the reading skills section, simply because it involves a lot of text-based information that you have to work through. Essentially, this section really tests your ability to identify, comprehend, and interpret text, to draw meaningful conclusions, really. And by using these same skills, you can avoid drawing the wrong conclusions from given information because you made some misunderstandings or made some assumptions. So what we mean by these 3 words is you'll be reading a series of passages and it asks questions based on the content of these passages. So you might be thinking, why exactly are these skills helpful? But realistically, in the future of your medical or dental career, these skills are important because they help you understand information about medical research and patient-based information that you'll come across, such as like patient histories and such. But these skills allow you to critically interpret and summarize those important points. And from these findings, you can then progress towards conclusions that you may choose to apply in your own practice or so on. But yeah, for the verbal reasoning section, you'll have 44 questions to answer in 21 minutes. Just straight from that, you can see it's already going to be very time pressured. But again, don't worry, the timing comes with the more practice you do and the mocks you do. So let's get on the actual question types in the verbal reasoning. So the 44 questions in the verbal reasoning section are equally divided across 11 separate subsections, each of which contains roughly 250 to 300 word passage and then 4 accompanying questions. So just to repeat that, you get 11 passages and each one with 4 questions essentially. You will only be expected to use the information in each of these text passages to help you answer the questions. And although these 11 subsections will contain roughly the same general format, there's 2 main types of questions to be familiar with. So one, we've got the true, false, can't tell questions. Essentially, these questions feature a statement that's based on the information in the passage, and then you're asked to conclude whether the statement is true, false, or you can't tell. To elaborate, you can only say the statement is true if the information in the text passage directly confirms the statement. So it's whether explicit or implicitly applied, it has to confirm the statement. Now, false, the information in the text passage has to contradict the statement. It has to be clear that there's a contradiction. And if not enough information is in the text passage, then you can just go can't tell because you can't confirm or deny the conclusion in every case possible. So with these questions, it's often useful to try and identify specific words or phrases that you find in the text passage that are also in the statement, because these can lead you to find parts of the passage with evidence to validate the statement. So for example, if your question is something about motorways, then you'd look through the passage, look for the word motorways, and then try and scan that to find the area where you might find evidence. So once you do this, you can find the evidence available and compare it with the statement directly to conclude whether or conclude the extent to which the statement is true. So while doing this, it's also always important to pay attention to smaller keywords like always, sometimes, and maybe. We'll talk more about that later, but essentially those can really change the meaning of a sentence. So the second type of question you can get, they're called the reading comprehension questions. And even these ones, they come into like sub-forms or different types. So the first one is an unfinished statement, and then these are essentially, they contain an unfinished statement about the events in a passage, and this is followed by 4 different answers that can finish the statement. For these questions, you're just basically expected to choose the answer that completes the statement in the most accurate way that relates to the passage. And then the other format is content questions, which is essentially you get a question based on the content of the text passage, and these are followed by 4 different answers that relate to the question. And for these ones, you just have to choose the answer that mostly closely matches the information in the text passage. Traditionally, these reading comprehension questions are slightly more difficult than the true, false, can't tell ones, because each of the 4 answer options is longer and must be checked individually as a result. So this means you can spend a lot more time on these, and really you should be spending more time on these compared to true, false, can't tell. So when you're planning your time, you might choose to spend less time on true, false, can't tell and more on reading comprehension. However, these are still similar to true, false, can't tell questions in the sense that you're still required to identify the same key points from the same text passage and then to make inferences to draw conclusions. Again, those same skills that keep coming up in your reading comprehension, these will be used again. So to answer these questions, like with the true, false, can't tell questions, a good start is just to identify specific words or phrases that you find in the text passage that are also present in the statement or question. This always will direct your attention to a specific section of the passage, maybe a paragraph or a sentence that you can reread or scan over to find evidence for your answer. We'll do some of that in the work example, but when you're looking for your evidence, your questions, you will find that the unfinished statement format generally has specific wording, so it's easier to find that evidence. But for the content question format, it's far less specific. There's 4 completely different answers, and you may have to check each of the answer options specifically before finding any actual evidence in the text. Regardless, it's important to try and use this keyword kind of searching thing. So when you're scanning over your text, you can look for your evidence very quickly. So that's the question formats. Let's talk a bit about some exam advice for verbal reasoning. So the first one is reading quickly and efficiently. Now, this might sound obvious, but there's a bit more to unpack from this. There are only 21 minutes for you to read 11 text passages in this section, and then consequently answer 44 questions. So you're under incredibly heavy time pressure. For those of you that want to read every single passage, you have to try and be able to read it very quickly, so that you have to read very quickly, sorry, so that you have enough time to answer the questions afterwards. However, it's also important to ensure that you're also reading with a clear understanding of the information that's in the passage, just so that you'll be able to remember the key points when answering the questions. This will help avoid you having to look back and reread the questions or the passage multiple times to try and search for the answer that you missed. So in order to achieve this efficiency in reading, we think it's really useful to try and practice reading sections like from books, news articles, or UCAT question banks. So if you don't do it already, like get a news article up, read it often, and then during this practice, try and read it quickly, comfortably, and then note down a concise format of the key points in the passage. Doing this often will just help you get more used to it, get more used to identifying key points, reading quickly, and with regular practice, I think you'll find you'll become faster at reading these passages and retaining key information, which are both incredibly useful for the verbal reasoning section. When one method that might be useful for reading quickly is chunking. Basically, before you read a passage, you break down the information into smaller sections. So usually you break them down to paragraphs. And then while reading the text passage, you just assign a mental note about what each smaller paragraph represents. So paragraph 1 might be about, let's say if we refer back to motorways, paragraph 1 might refer to how motorways are made. Paragraph 2 might refer to like accidents on motorways and so on. It's just writing a mental note for each chunk so that when you get a question about, let's say, how motorways are made, you can say, okay, refer back to paragraph 1 rather than checking through the whole passage. So effectively, you're cataloging the long text passage into small labeled sections that let you revisit what you're looking for very quickly. Alternatively, if you're still struggling with timing and don't think you can read fast enough, you might want to try a method called skimming. Essentially, you need to read the question first to identify keywords and phrases, and then really quickly scan over, not even reading, just look for the key words and try and get the general gist of the sentences rather than reading in depth. And this will save you a lot more time because you don't actually have to read the whole passage, you're just looking for keywords, but it isn't the most accurate thing. So often you'll find that you might not end up the answer you're looking for. So it's more of like a last ditch attempt if you find that you're really running out of time for the last few questions. All these different methods are available for you to use. So it's important for you to try and find out which one works best for you. Some work better than others. So give it a go in your practice, right? Untimed practice first and then timed, and it marks the same free cycle of going through those things. Okay, so the next step is reading the question properly. Well, ultimately, the goal is to answer each of the questions in the verbal reasoning section. So it's important to understand the questions in the first place. Even the smallest details in the question wording can help you differentiate between some of the similar answers presented to you. So you may find it useful to quickly reread each of the 4 questions in each subsection before reading the actual passage, because doing this means you can then look for specific keywords or phrases, and it means that you just have a general idea of what you're looking for before you read the passage. Another reason why it's important to read the question properly is because there could be really, really small keywords that slightly alter the meaning of the question, and they can literally trip you up. They throw you off in the wrong direction, and that consequently affects the answer that you choose. The next section, identify keywords, kind of covers this. We're talking about the small words such as always, all, certain, frequently, average, rarely, cannot, impossible, never. All those small words that can completely change the meaning of a sentence. The key ones to pay attention to are things like always, all, and certain, which means that an event will always happen, and then cannot, impossible, never, and none. Like they mean an event will never happen, because when you have definitive keywords like those, they alter the sentence meaning in a way that means that you can say for certain that something's happening. So that's a true, false, can't tell questions, or they make it in a way that it can never happen. So that's a false, true, false, can't tell questions. Things like average or rarely or sometimes, they're more there to throw you off. They're more there for can't tell options. So you generally have this on the scale of how definite it is. Try and avoid the ones in the center. Obviously, the ones there are meant to throw you off. They're more general. So always pay attention to the keywords, both in the questions and answers, because they come up in both, and missing them could literally lead you to losing a mark for seemingly small reason, essentially. So the next bit is about separating links and causation. So This is more commonly known as correlation, does not imply causation. We've written it slightly differently there because you might be sick of the phrase, but it's important to be able to apply this principle when reading through a text passage to just help you avoid making assumptions about two factors that are probably not related. So if I give you an example, statistics show that individuals who heavily consume alcohol are found to develop lung disease throughout their lives. Although that sentence suggests that there is a statistical link between alcohol consumption and lung disease, there is not actually any actual evidence from that line to prove that there is a causal link between the two factors. Consequently, if you're then to ask or answer, a true false can't tell question phrased as alcohol consumption causes lung disease, the correct answer would actually be can't tell instead of true. This is because even though the passage really strongly suggests that it does, there's not enough actual evidence to prove that there's a heavy alcohol consumption leading to lung disease in the first place. But it's also really important to pay attention that there's no evidence to prove that, to rule out that the possibility of alcohol consumption could lead to lung disease. So you can't actually say the statement is false either. That's just one example. We'll go through more later on, but that's just an example of how you should make sure you don't fall for the trick of saying correlation means causation. Now, ignoring prior knowledge, this is a really minor point, but at the same time, it's really important. When answering all the questions in the verbal reasoning section of the UCAT, you should never use any information that you knew before the exam. So what I'm saying is you can only use the information provided to you in the text passages and their respective questions. Even if you're familiar with the topic presented to you in a subsection, just try to forget about it for now when answering the questions, as you may end up subconsciously or consciously picking an answer that you know is right, but isn't actually right based off the information in the actual passage. So with those exam advice out of the way, let's look at some questions. So this is a true false can't tell example about dental abscesses. And here, just before I'm going to go through the text passage, I just want to say I'm going to be reading through this and working through this fairly slowly. So please keep in mind that in the real exam, you should be trying to answer this as fast as you can and not like I'm doing. But try and see how I'm applying the same methods from the exam advice. So before I begin, I'm going to quickly look at the question here. As applying a warm pack to an affected tooth is likely to reduce symptoms. So what I can pick up from this is, firstly, warm pack is a keyword. So warmth in general is something I need to look out for. And then pain symptoms is something I need to look out for. These are like my two main keywords I'm going to be looking out for. So I'm going to quickly read this section. A dental abscess, also termed a dentoalveolar abscess, tooth abscess, or root abscess, is a localized collection of pus associated with a tooth. The most common type of dental abscess is a periapical abscess, and the second most common type is a periodontal abscess. In a periapical abscess, usually the origin is a bacterial infection that's accumulated in the soft, often dead pulp of the tooth. This can be caused by tooth decay, broken teeth, or extensive periodontal disease, or a combination of these factors. A failed root canal treatment may create a similar abscess. So before I continue, I'm going to do what I just said about chunkings. This first section, I'm going to say, is about dental abscesses. And I'm just going to take a mental note. So if I got a question about abscesses, I know to return up here. Now, this second paragraph, I'm going to quickly read. Well, the pain is continuous and may be described as shameful. There's our keyword we just saw. We want to keep attention to this paragraph. Growing sharp, shooting, or throbbing. Putting pressure or warmth, there's another keyword on the tooth, induces extreme pain. And again, we see this keyword that we saw from down here. Now, in a normal context, I would continue reading the passage and look for more keywords based on the other questions. But since we've basically got all the information we need, we can just use what we've got here to save time. So our question was, applying a warm pack to an affected tooth is likely to reduce pain symptoms. Well, this sentence here, putting pressure or warmth on the tooth induces extreme pain. This is directly contradicting the statement, so we can quite confidently say that the answer is false. It's not a can't tell because we know for a fact that warmth will cause extreme pain, and that's directly contradicting to the pain symptoms bit. For the sake of completion, if I were to catalog this one too, I would probably say this is about pain or symptoms from dental abscesses. So again, if I went to answer more questions about it later on, I would refer to this if I needed to talk about symptoms. So that's our first example. Here is our second example. It's about reading comprehension this time. Fairly topical in this example as well. But here, we're going to begin by reading our question again. Which of the following best summarizes the motivation against flying described by the passage? Now, this time we've been really lucky because they've highlighted this for us. Motivation against flying in these two apostrophes. Normally, this isn't done for you and you'll have to kind of look for this yourself. But yeah, motivation against flying, that's our key phrase because there's nothing else really to work with. And then we've got our 4 options here. If you're going to scan, I would recommend looking at these options before you read the passage. But because we're going to go through this in quite deep detail, we can look at each of the answer options later. So prior to the coronavirus pandemic, airlines have been wrestling with different motivation against flying. There you go. This is our key phrase. Pay very close attention to this. Aviation accounts for 12% of all carbon dioxide emissions from transport, and flying is so cheap and easy that we can add unthinkingly to that gush of carbon in the seconds it takes to book a ticket on an app. London to New York and back creates 1,972 kilograms of carbon dioxide, more than an average person in Madagascar or Colombia generates a year. So this first bit, we're going to talk about, essentially, we're just covering the motivations against flying, which is exactly what we're looking for. Again, if it was a full passage, I would try and read the next bits as well, look for keywords and to help answer the other 3 questions. But in this case, we're only looking at this one question, so we're going to ignore them for now. But if I were, for the sake of completion again, I would say this one is based off motivation against flying. This is based off the KLM ad. And this is based off the development of a vaccine. So very quickly, I'm aware of the time running out fairly shortly. I'm going to say this is how we're going to organize it. And since we're looking for motivation against flying, we're going to ignore these paragraphs down here and refer directly to this one. So prior to the coronavirus pandemic, airlines have been wrestling with a different motivation against flying. Now, this suggests that whatever comes up in the next sentence is going to be exactly what we're looking for. It's going to be the motivation against flying. And if we read it, it says aviation accounts for 12% of all carbon dioxide emissions from transport, and flying is so cheap and easy that we can add unthinkingly to the gush of carbon in the seconds it takes to book a ticket on an app. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but if you ever get stuck from trying to look for an answer, it's better to start looking at the answer options and seeing if you can work from there. So let's say we start looking at the answer options. This first one here, one cheap and easy flight generates more CO2 than an average Colombian in a year. This is tempting. It looks right because we did have a reference here to the average carbon dioxide creation and then compared to Colombia or Madagascar, but you have to pay attention to the wording. One cheap and easy flight is referenced in the answer option, but here it's London to New York and back. So this is actually 2 flights. So this cannot be the right answer simply because of some tricky wording. Here we've highlighted as the right answer is simply because the pollution generated by flying is disproportionate to the consideration we give it. This is a nod to this phrase here. The pollution generated by flying is disproportionate to the consideration we give it. So the consideration we give it, we can add unthinkingly to that gush of carbon. We're not really thinking actively about the effect of carbon when we fly. And then the pollution generated by flying is reflected by the fact that over here we're saying, yeah, a trip from London to New York and back creates a lot of carbon dioxide. So just clear things up. That's our answer for that sake. We can look at the other 2 answers actually before we go, just because they look like they could be right, but they aren't. So actions we don't even think about through contribute to 12% of overall carbon emissions. Now, this first bit is right. We don't even think about these actions. That's another way of saying like we don't give much consideration or we add unthinkingly to. But this second bit, 12% of overall carbon emissions is what actually drives this wrong. So this figure, you might have seen 12% up here. And it says aviation accounts for 12% of all carbon emissions from transport. But here you see it says all overall carbon emissions. So these 2 things are not directly comparable. This is just from transport. This is from everything. And in the 4th option, let's have a quick look. We're creating carbon emissions with a simple tap on our smartphone. Well, it's somewhat relevant because it's kind of simplifying the fact that we are booking tickets and that's adding to the carbon when we take the flights, but it just simply isn't specific enough. It takes what was said in this passage far too literally, and it's not necessarily the main motivation against flying, which is just the pollution we generate. We're not really aware of it. So that's reading comprehension in a nutshell, done very quickly. And with that, we're done with verbal reasoning. So we're going to quickly move on to the decision-making section now. So the decision-making section, this is usually known as the logical reasoning and problem-solving section, simply because the questions you're presented with are like progressive puzzles and diagrams that you have to actually solve. Some people enjoy it, most people don't because it's very difficult, but the key skills here are evaluating arguments, applying logic, and interpreting data in different formats so you can reach a conclusion, essentially. They're really is a lot of different skills that are being tested here, so it's hard to like summarize in these 3 words, but we'll go over them in a moment. These are just some of the important recurring ones. So you might be asking, why is this important to a medical career? Well, these are just skills that you'll regularly need to apply. You'll often be required to make decisions when presented with like complex scenarios, and to make the most appropriate decisions, you need to have sound decision making. You need to be able to balance different factors and assess any potential risks in, let's say, a hospital. So the problem solving skills you consequently develop will be really useful in both clinical practice when you're working with patients and just in general life. So here, they've been a bit more friendly with the timing of this one. 31 questions for 29 minutes. But saying that, these are very long questions. They can take a lot longer to do. And because of that, you might get caught up spending too much time on ones that you probably shouldn't be spending on. Here we also see the first time questions where there are like kind of multiple parts to it. So the one I'm referring to, you most probably known as the yes/no questions or syllogisms. We'll get onto those in more detail later on. So question types. There's 6 main question types in the decision-making section, and these have a different distribution every year, but let's go through each of them in order. So evaluating argument question types. This is the for or against question stem that is based on the suitability of a particular solution for a given issue. So you've got 2 parts, 1 issue and you've got 1 solution. You'll then be presented with 4 different arguments as your answer options, and then you have to choose which you believe is the strongest argument in response to the question stem. The main focus of this question is for you to basically be able to objectively evaluate each argument available and compare them with each other before making a decision to say, okay, this is the strongest argument, or that's definitely not the strongest argument. When trying to identify the strongest argument available, there's a few things you should look out for. It's always important to look for arguments that are fully relevant to the question stem. So that means it has to refer to both the problem at hand and the solution that's being proposed. Questions that don't refer to this at all, they're irrelevant. They're not strong arguments simply because they kind of just ignore the question at hand. They might seemingly be relevant, but realistically, upon further inspection, you tend to find that it's pretty obvious when you see that aren't relevant. Strong arguments usually should also never contain assumptions. Assumptions are not necessarily true, meaning that any arguments based on them are not necessarily true in all accounts. So when trying to find the strongest argument, try and avoid any examples you see with assumptions in them, and instead look for ones that might have data or facts or statistics backing them up. Although these don't always guarantee that the argument is going to be strong, arguments that usually have relevant statistics can be considered reliable and strong arguments to have. Then we've got data interpretation ones. These present data to you in a range of different formats, and you'll be expected to use the data in order to reach a conclusion. So there are 2 main types of data interpreting questions. So the first one's your text-based ones. These ones present essentially information in several lines of text. You've got a paragraph essentially, and you just got to use the different values, different information to reach a conclusion. And then the nicer ones, the diagram-based ones, present information through different visual representations. So pie charts, tables, graphs, all the things you might be familiar with in maths. You'll be expected to interpret the data and then reach a conclusion that matches one of the answer options. When answering both types of questions, it's important just to make sure you spend enough time analyzing the data you're given. That is the point of the question, but make sure you look at it fully, look for anything that might catch you up before you reach an answer. Doing this just means that you're less likely to misinterpret the data or make a mistake when you're trying to identify specific values. And this extends to just make sure you read the question properly so you know what you're actually looking for in the data before you begin analyzing. So after that, we've got logical puzzles. These can take a very long time. They're basically logic-based problems that you have to solve using a series of rules that are given to you. Again, these have 2 main formats. Text-based puzzles, essentially just similar to data interpretation. You get a full paragraph full of information for you to use together, and very closely linked statements. You have to use these together in order to reach a feasible conclusion that most accurately answers the question given to you. And then the second format is the diagram-based puzzles. These are very similar, but they include a diagram that you usually have to fill in as well. So in this case, we'd always say make use of the whiteboard. Always keep track of your working, because logic problems, it's a progression, right? You have steps to go, and if you trip up somewhere along the way, you want to be able to fall back on the steps you're working on rather than having to start back at the beginning. So logic puzzles, all out working for it quickly enough so you don't run out of time, but slowly enough so you fully understand and appreciate the data that's being given to you. So 4, probability questions. These are essentially questions that present you with a paragraph or a question stem containing information about statistical probabilities, and then you just be presented with a scenario asking you which conclusion most accurately matches the statistical information represented to you. So these ones, very similar to maths, GCSE maths questions. It's all about interpreting data well. Syllogisms, these are the ones that people tend to dislike the most. These consist of a question stem, sometimes a diagram, but a question stem with a series of logical statements, and then you get 5 proposed conclusions or 5 sub-questions and a yes or no answer to choose from. The aim of this question is for you to use the information provided in the question stem to draw conclusions about the validity of each sub-question statement as fast as possible. So when answering the sub-questions, you'll just have to make sure you spend enough time reading the question and information carefully, looking out for keywords, looking out for small things that could trip you up to ensure you don't miss any points at all. Then you just have to keep checking back each of the sub-questions against the information from the stem to reach a conclusion. And this is where it's really important to be able to spot those keywords, because it means you don't have to keep reading the whole question stem when you're looking for one tiny piece of information to validate your conclusion. Again, like with most other parts of the UCAT, you should try not to use any prior knowledge in this. Only use the information in the question, because the second you introduce other prior external knowledge, you can just end up tripping up. And then lastly, you've got Venn-Euler diagram questions. So Venn-Euler diagrams are very similar to each other, but essentially you're given a diagram and you're made to interpret data from it. So there are 2 main types. The first one is choosing a numeric value or shape based on the information presented in a diagram. So you're going to be given a diagram, and then you're going to be asked questions based on, okay, how many people are in this group, or how many people are in this group but not this group. So for these questions, you just have to be able to make sure you understand the overlaps, understand the key, what it's telling you, and then be able to extract the information from the diagram as fast as possible. The other format for Venn diagram questions is you'll be presented instead with a long question stem, and then your answer options will be 4 different Venn diagrams that you have to pick from. So your job here is to try and organize that data into a reasonable Venn diagram and pick that out from the answer options. So in this case, it'd be really important for you to use the whiteboard, because it's there for you to be used, and really it helps a lot for when you have these visual types of problems in decision making. So let's talk a bit about the exam advice. So like we said before in verbal reasoning, keywords is really important, but actually for decision making, it helps if you visit the official UCAT website and look at the officially listed keywords. There they've got a list of definitions for keywords. I'll read a few examples now. So it says all is an unspecified number referring to the whole of it or everything. Many, an undetermined number, similar to some, a part of all but not all of it. And then something like few, a number that's less than 50% but not none. So these are definitions that you should probably get familiar with. Again, they're on the UCAT website. They're also on our ebook, but just spend some time, make sure you understand what they mean in the decision-making sense. These definitions are just for questions in the decision-making. In verbal reasoning, they might have similar meanings, but take them with a pinch of salt. So using the whiteboard, we've gone through this already. Essentially, make sure you just keep track of all you're working out, so you don't, you can easily spot any mistakes you make, and so you can fall back on something if you realize you make a wrong turn in your decision-making progression. So using the answer options, what we mean by this is, for a lot of the logic-based questions, you sometimes can make use of the answer options given to you if you become stuck. So let's say you work halfway through a question using the rules, and then you really don't know where to progress from there. Have a look at the answer options. Sometimes you'll find something that's just a tiny logical leap away, and then you can feasibly guess, okay, it will probably be that thing. And in this case, you not only do you save yourself some time, you probably will get the mark in the end. And this extends to kind of not actually needing to complete logic questions in general. A lot of the time, especially in the word example you're going to see later on, you don't actually have to fully complete a logic question or a logic puzzle. You can instead begin by eliminating the possible options that the answer could be for your working steps. So by using this process of elimination, right, you can start saying, okay, it can't be that, it can't be that, it can't be that, it can't be that, therefore it must be this, before you actually finish the problem. Again, we'll go through that in a work example, but other things, remaining objective. this is probably most applicable to the evaluating argument questions, because when you read a statement or a question and you are familiar with it or you feel strongly about it, there's always that subconscious or conscious tendency to answer something that you believe in. But it's important because for you to be objective, because the main focus of this question is for you to choose the argument you think is most relevant, irrespective of what you believe. It's important to set aside your personal beliefs or knowledge, because they only want to see your ability to evaluate arguments. So in that sense, that's why you remain objective. Also, that's why you should ignore prior knowledge, for the same reasons we said in verbal reasoning, but also because, yeah, you should be sticking to the information given to you only when evaluating arguments. Now, applying logic rules, looking at the time, we probably won't have enough time to go over them now, but they are explained in depth with examples in our ebook. So keep a lookout for that. I know I keep saying it, but it is very detailed there. So now we're going to be quickly moving on to our worked examples. So here, our first example is evaluating arguments. So like we said, two parts of evaluating arguments. So the first part is student attendance. Let me just get up my drawing thing. Attending fewer lectures if recorded and uploaded to the internet. So this one isn't a solution and problem one per se, but it is a example that still features two main parts to it. So attending student attendance is one thing, and then recording and uploading online lectures is the other. So let's look at each of these examples in detail. Yes, lecturers would be less likely to give lecturers would be less likely to give lectures if fewer students turned up because the lectures were available online. Well, this was quite a difficult one, but if we break it down, going backwards, you can see that it's saying, well, because the lectures are being available online, if fewer students turn up, lecturers would be less likely to give lectures. What I've just done there is I've shown you that it's a relatively weak argument because it's based on a conditional statement. This if here means that the argument is only true, doesn't necessarily apply to every case, and it only addresses one possibility. So it's not something we can rely on for being robust as a robust argument. So this one is not necessarily the strongest, but we don't have to rule it out just yet. Here, yes, the younger generation are better at using the internet than the older generation. And we don't even have to read this next bit, but this bit here, right here, this is a generalization. The younger generation are better at using the internet. It might be true, but it's a generalization, and that's a type of assumption. We shouldn't be relying on arguments involving assumptions, so we can quite confidently cross this one out. Now this one, some students benefit from the structure of a lecture timetable that helps educate them on the importance of attendance and maintaining a routine schedule in their future lives. This, it does appear to be relevant because it mentions the effect of a lecture timetable. So that's one part here. And it then extends to mentioning how it teaches the importance of this to students. Now, the important thing to know here is that it doesn't actually link the availability of online lessons to student attendance itself. It says that it will educate students on the importance of attendance, right? But it doesn't necessarily say that it will cause a change in attendance, if that makes sense. So this is an example of trying to trick you by appearing relevant to the 2 points we've got up here, but realistically, it's not fully linked. Now, for our last example, no, the majority of students have been, if I just quickly see, have been demonstrated to learn better from receiving teaching in person than from viewing information online, which would incentivize them to continue to attend lectures. Here, we've got a strong argument for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because we just said that other three are relatively weak, so this would, by process of elimination, probably be the right one. In an exam setting, you could just pick this one and go on to the next question. But for the sake of completion, let's go through why this is quite a good argument. So, firstly, this is a strong argument because we begin with some clear evidence. So this bit about the majority of students having been demonstrated to learn better from receiving teaching in person than online, that's evidence. It doesn't appear to be evidence, like, because you don't have statistics, but it's meant to be shown as text evidence. Now, this evidence doesn't necessarily appear to be relevant by itself, but this next bit of the argument, which states how this would incentivize students to continue to attend lectures, this directly applies the evidence to the key points of the argument, to student attendance and online lectures. So it directly links the evidence back to the statement, and we can say, okay, with fairly good certainty that, well, it points out to both these important points in the question and presents evidence. So we can probably say this is the right argument to pick. So we'll just get to the next question. So this one is an example of data interpretation. Before I begin, I'm just going to quickly look at the graph. I see I've got a type of simplified line graph of number of books on this side and a year on this side. And now I've done that, I'm going to quickly just read the question. A new town library opened in 2013, and since then the number of books in the library have been monitored and recorded by the head librarian every year. The graph below depicts the number of books that the librarian recorded every year. So I know what this is already about because I just had a scan of it, and I'm just going to say the general trend is an increase. There is a little dip down here, but in general, we just have an increase, and that's something that might be relevant later on. We then ask, which of the following can be concluded from the data? Well, the number of books in the library has continually increased since 2013. This appears to be true, but this word here specifically, continually increased, suggests that it would have to be a direct increase, no decreases at all. So this cannot be true simply because of this small dip we had in 2015. You can't say that it continually increased for every year. So this can't be true. This library, like all libraries, contain books. Now this would appear to be true because most libraries, I'd imagine, would contain books. But again, you can't rely on prior knowledge, and this is why. The question doesn't say anything about all the other libraries. This library, for example, does contain books, right? But all the other ones, there's nothing mentioned about them. So we don't actually know. We can't conclude if those other libraries contain books. And that's just another example, as I say, that you shouldn't rely on prior knowledge. So we actually can't say this one either. Between 2016 and 2018, more books were bought for the library. Now, if you look at the question, there is an increase. From 2016, we have 800. And 2018 we have 1600, right? So this, you might be tempted to say, yeah, more books were bought for the library, but again, there's not enough information to conclude this simply because we're not told how these books were retrieved. It could be very well that these books were all donated by some organization or some charity, and in that case, none of these books were actually bought for the library, which would render this statement here wrong. So again, for all three of these, they appear to be right, but if you look really closely, in all of these cases, there's just not enough data to conclude that they're right. Whereas if you look at this last question, the number of books in the library doubled within a 2-year period. Now, this can be answered by all the questions, all the data we have in this graph. For example, we just proved that 2016 there was 800, and in 2018 there's 1600. This is exactly a double, and it took place across 2 years, so we can say for certain that's true. Now, another reason we could have said it's true, obviously, because these first three weren't right. But yeah, this is the main method. Just making sure the answers in here are based completely on the information you have. So, let's get the next one. Here we've got a logic puzzle. This one's a lot more difficult, and these tend to take a lot more time, but we'll try and work for them logically using the information we've got. So 5 students in a medical school have to select an area of interest to study for a month in their 4th year. They can choose to study either medicine, surgery, literature, or medical research, and must either make a poster about their work or present their work in a short organization. So these are our rules. I'm not gonna, sorry about that. I'm not gonna touch those rules just yet. I just want to use the information that I've got so far. And it will also conclude a few things. So we have students, that's one part. Then we have a type of medicine or a type of thing that they're studying, so medicine, surgery, literature, or medical research. So let's say that's a specialty. And then we've got how they present their work. So how they present the work, we'll say PR. So in this case, we have 5 students. In this case, we have medicine, surgery, literature, or medical research. And in this case, we've either got a poster or presentation. So let's work through the rules we've been given. James and Cornelia, so we know our first 2 students are James and Cornelia. Well, only want to study the same subject, so this bit we can't use just yet, but we'll use it later on. Now, Mildred studied neither medicine or literature. Another way to perceive that is that she had to have studied, because she wasn't medicine or literature, she had to study either surgery or medical research. Then we've got Adrian did not make a poster and study a different subject for everyone else. Okay, so Adrian did not make a poster, therefore he had to make a presentation. Simply because there's only 2 options here. So again, this bit we can't use just yet, but we will come back to it later. Cornelia made a poster about her surgical area of interest. So Cornelia did surgery and she made a poster. So, and then Joseph, our 5th student, did literature. Okay, so let's go back to the rules that we couldn't use just then. James and Cornelia were the only ones to study the same subject. So we know Cornelia did surgery, right? So she had to have done surgery with James since they did the same one. Now, since they were the only ones to study the same subject, Mildred could not have studied surgery either. So out of her surgery or medical research, she must have done medical research. And that leaves us with Adrian, who studied a different subject from everyone else. Well, we got told there's either medicine, surgery, literature, or medical research that you can do. We know for a fact that James and Cornelia are doing surgery. We know that Joseph is doing literature, and we know that Mildred is doing medical research. So James must be doing, Adrian, must be doing medicine. And we know earlier that he didn't make a poster, so therefore he made a presentation. That leads us to this example, this answer option here. He gave a presentation about medicine. In this case, we don't have to check the other options because if we know for certain this is right, it's not worth spending time just to verify it. So that's this one. To our next section, probability. So this is an example of a probability question in the decision making, and this is what I mean when I say it's similar to GCSE questions. There's just a lot of statistical information given to you, and you're meant to simplify it. So a fried chicken shop and a burger shop have an equal number of vending machines. Each day, 8% of the machines are unusable in the fried chicken shop, and 60% are usable in the burger shop. Okay, so let's just write this down. So chicken shop, right? We have 8% of the machines are unusable. That means 92% are usable, right? And then in the burger shop, only 60% are usable. Let's just write these things down, so we might use them later, right? The chance that the usable machine will break down any given day is 1 in 20 in the chicken shop and 2 in 40 in the burger shop. So in terms of like breaking down chances, it's 1 in 20 here in the chicken shop and 2 in 40 here in the burger shop. What you'll notice is that these two probabilities are equal to each other. If you're good with fractions, you'll know they're both 5%. So that's one thing to consider, and we'll probably be paying attention to this. So now we're told, considering the only the usability and chance of a machine breakdown, is the burger shop the better shop to use a vending machine in? Well, we know for a fact that both of them have an equal chance of breaking down, but the chicken shop actually has a higher percentage of machines being usable at 92% compared to the burger shop at 60%. So no, we will say no. Both shops have the same chance of machines breaking down, but the burger shop has fewer usable machines, and that's based off us just checking this information here. So that's the probability question done. We've now got the syllogism question. This is the one that most people don't like simply because it takes a lot of time, but with more practice, you tend to get a lot faster at doing these questions. So let's go through this one together. In order to enter the school netball team, all students must meet some requirements. I'm going to put a line there just so we clear it up. Any new team member must not have played for a rival school in the last 6 months, except for where they played less than 5 games for them. Another line there. Some new team members are subject to fitness tests, while others can enter the team without this. Another line there. And to play competitively, a team must have 25 or fewer registered members. Now, the reason I've drawn these lines is because I want to show you that these are essentially, rather than a paragraph, you should see it as 4 key rules that you have to apply in these logical contexts. It just helps break it down into more digestible form, really. And now we just have to compare these rules with the statements that have been given here, saying yes or no if they follow or not, respectively. So our first statement: if Emily wants to join the school netball team, she'll take part in a fitness test. Well, fitness is a key word here, or fitness test instead, and we just have to look back for all our statements, and we'll find that fitness test is here in this statement here. Some new team members are subject to fitness tests, while others can enter the team without this. So we have no way of telling if Emily has to take part of this fitness test or not. So we would be unable to kind of just conclude if she has to take one or not. Therefore, we just go with no. If you want to think about it in a yes, no, can't tell way, yes would be yes, and then no or can't tell would just be no, because there's not enough information. That's another way of seeing it. So moving on, Rachel played 5 games for a rival school 2 months ago. She will therefore pass the requirements described in the STEM to join the school team. Well, let's see. Rival schools is our main point here. Any new team member must not have played for a rival school in the last 6 months, except for where they played less than 5 games for them. Oh, someone might be unmuted. Well, the main thing to point out here is, 1 second. The main thing to look for here is that any new team member must not have played for a rival school in the last 6 months. Whereas here, she played 5 games 2 months ago. So we can clearly see that Rachel playing 2 months ago won't be able to join the school team. So again, we're just going to put a no for that. A student could join the team without meeting any certain requirements in the circumstances. Now, this can be confusing because it feels like you'd have to check every single requirement. But again, if you stick to the keyword method and you look at any requirements here, you can see that this first line, again, requirements here would say, in order to enter the school netball team, all students must meet at least some requirements. So it wouldn't be fair to conclude that you can join without meeting any requirements at all. So no, we say no for that one. This next one is more about a case of maths. It says 18 members were registered to a team, with 13 new members then registered while 6 old members resigned. So this is just a case of doing maths. So we start with 18, 13 members join, so we end up with 31, and then 6 leave. So now we end up with 25, right? And then this team is still eligible to play competitively. Well, this last sentence here, you must have 25 or fewer registered members. So we can actually say, yes, we will finish. They can play in the games. And then here we've got Juliet has played 10 games for a rival school. She'll therefore be unable to join the team. Now, it's really tempting to say yes to this statement, because here it says any new team member must not have played for a rival school in the last 6 months, except for where they played less than 5 games for them. And then you might be sitting here thinking, well, she just played 10 games for them. There's no way she'd be allowed. But again, it's down to a lack of information. Here it says only if they haven't played for rival school in the last 6 months. We have no idea of telling when Juliet played those games. It could be the case that she played them 7 months ago, and therefore she would be this rule would not apply to her, because she could have played as many games as she wants, since they're out of the 6-month boundary. So we can't reasonably conclude that this is the case. So again, for this one, we'd say no as well. And just like that, these take a long time to go through. So it's always important to try and do these as fast as you can. Normally what happens is you'll be able to answer some, and for the rest you probably just have to guess. But in these cases, since it's yes or no, it's not unreasonable to be able to throw a few guesses around. And Venn diagram questions, these are our last type, I think. This is a very simple Venn diagram questions. What's important to pay attention to here is the key over here, and the important keywords in our question. So we've got 84 children came to a birthday party wearing different outfits, which included face paint, hats, glitter, hair dye, and masks. That's all here. And some children wore a combination of these outfits. That's shown in the overlaps between some of these shapes. So based on the diagram, how many children wore face paint but not masks? So again, pay attention to these keywords. Face paint, oh, sorry, that's large. Face paint but not masks. Another way of seeing it is, think about all the numbers or values that are in the circle but as not in the arrow. So our attention should be drawn here. And we should be looking specifically at this 4, 7, and 15, because these are all inside the circle, but not inside this arrow here. These are technically inside the circle, but they're also inside the arrow, so they don't fit our criteria. If we just add 4, 7, and 15 together, you end up with 16, which is the answer. So that's a very quick Venn diagram question. We're going to now move on to the quantitative reasoning section. Let's quickly move down. So this section of the UCAT is usually known as the math section, because you're just working with so many numbers. Essentially, you're going to be tested on your ability to interpret it and manipulate numerical data, which essentially just means you're going to be doing lots of calculations to help solve problems. The most application-based form of these skills is when in your medical career, you may often need to rely on calculating drug dosages, and that's the main case for maths in medicine. But on a more advanced level, you might also find these skills useful when interpreting statistics presented on clinical research. So this one, again, is a bit more friendly to time, and you get 36 questions for to do in 24 minutes. Not as harsh as the verbal reasoning, but still fairly harsh nonetheless. Oh. Now, let's talk about the question types. The 36 questions in the quantitative reasoning are divided across 9 subsections. So each of these subsections contains a detailed question stems and then 4 accompanying questions. Now, these 4 questions can be based on a wide range of topics, but they mainly stem from your GCSE, level maths, and a strong pass is what the UCAT consortium says is needed to do well in this section. These question types we've included here, I have to stress, are not the only things that can come up. These are just some very common themes that appear and that we'd like to just go through real quickly while answering them. So I'll take you through some work examples after covering some exam advice. But these themes, they tend to come up very, very often. So it's important to make sure you can do well in all of these. So just for the exam advice, we've got using the UCAT calculator. So the UCAT calculator is a TI Model 108. You will have an access to this calculator by doing Control-C. That's the shortcut for it, but you can also manually click it. Now, this UCAT calculator, it looks very primitive. You probably have more complex ones, but it's still something that's useful that you should be able to use confidently, because just there are some questions that involve very big numbers and some calculations that you just can't do in your head. So the most basic functions are still here: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. All these work in the way you'd expect them to. But what I'd like to stress or talk about a bit is these memory options here. Now, this calculator contains these N buttons for memory functions, and I'll just describe each of their functions now. So this MRC stands for memory recall, and when it's pressed alone, this button recalls the memory that you've stored in the calculator's kind of memory bank. And then when you press memory recall after memory minus, that clears the memory. You're probably wondering, how do we get things in the memory in the first place? That's what this M plus button is for. Memory sum essentially adds whatever value you've got up here in this display into the memory bank overall. So that's how they work in general. When you've got these calculations to do, you'll tend to find that you'll want to reach for the calculator whenever you can. But it's really important to try not to spend too much time using the calculator, because it always takes time to get it up. It takes time to put things in. So make sure you limit your use of the calculator to only when you need to. That does mean you have to get good at your mental maths, just so you can do as many calculations as you can in your head. But yeah, it's there for you to use when you need it. Now, other things you said, using the whiteboard. This is important because it's just nice to be able to keep track of the numbers that you're using in your calculations. Let's say you've got a 4-step calculation. You don't really ever want to lose the number along the way. So just, even if you don't want to write your full working out to save time, just write down the key values that you're working with, so you don't muddle them up with anything while you're performing too many calculations. Now, using the answer options is another thing like you've come across in the decision making before. For some options, or sorry, for some questions, it might actually be better for you to start looking at the options before you complete your calculations. The reason for this is because you might get given something like solve the subject of the equation, and then it is very easy for you to just then plug in the different answer options available and see what works. So it's rare, particularly rarer in quantitative reasoning than decision making, but sometimes if you're stuck, don't be afraid to look at the answer options and see if you can use them. Now, the quantitative reasoning is probably where time management is the most variable in the UCAT, simply because the extent or the difficulty of some questions can really vary. You can get some extremely simple questions that literally can take one calculation, and you can get some very difficult ones that take 4, maybe 5 calculations to do. So it's really important that you manage your timing in a way that means that you spend more time on the difficult questions and less time on the easier questions. Yeah, that's the right order. It's just making sure that you don't dwell too long, double checking, triple checking your simple ones, and make sure just so you don't take time away from the difficult ones. And this last bit I've got here, revision. It's simply because there's so many different math skills that you'll need to use in the quantitative reasoning section that you may find it useful to just revisit your basic maths as part of preparation. GCSE maths is always a good place to start. So it'd always be ideal to revise using any GCSE maths resources you have. And if you prefer online resources, then things like Maths Genie and Physics and Maths Tutor are really useful for just content revision in general. So let's begin with a few examples. A pie chart question. So again, these are different common themes, but a pie chart or graph or table question, these will nearly always come up because they test your ability to interpret data. Now, I have to apologize. The color scheme is not very helpful, but it doesn't matter too much for this question because we're given labels. The question states that the chart below shows the type and proportion of materials being recycled by weight as measured by City Council over the course of a year. So if there was 167 kilograms of plastic recycled, so important data here, what weight did the other recycling count for? So this is important and this is important. So one way to do this is to do it by unitary method or percentages. What we can say is that we know for a fact that 167 kg equals 12.7% of the mass, right? That's what this pie chart essentially tells us. So let's find, when we need to find out what 3.4% of the mass is. I would say we can begin by trying to find out what 1% is. So if you know this is 12.7%, dividing this by 12.7 will give you a result of 13.1 kilograms. And this is equivalent to 1% of your data. Simply because we divided by 12.7 this side, we have to divide by 12.7% this side. So what we've just done, a simple calculation, we know now that 13.1 kilograms is 1%. And now to get to 3.4%, we just have to do 13.1 times 3.4%. And that gives us, well, let's see, on a calculator, 44.7 kilograms in total. Now, you know, an example of not using the answer options, you can tell this is in the right range, or you've done the right thing, because all these answer options are in this sort of 44 range. And actually, we've got our exact answer here, so we know it's right in this case. But yeah, if you ever get something that's far from all the answer options, it generally means you might have done something wrong in your method, so you revisit it, or if you've pressed the time, let's go on to the next question. It's not worth redoing it again. So that's a pie chart question. Here we've got one of our more simple questions. So the easiest way to do this is, well, let me read that question first. Anita is using a baking recipe which makes 8 scones. The recipe requires 225 grams of flour, and how much flour is needed to make 20 of them? Well, the easiest way is to say 225 makes 8. So we divide 225 by 8 to get how much it takes to make 1. So 225 divided by 8 should give us, if I do this on the calculator, 28.125. And if we just multiply that by 20 to get a result of 562.5 grams. So this is a very simple calculation of just dividing by 1 to get a unit and then times it by 20 to get out. And that's why I've selected this answer here. The reason I've done this question here is because I want to show you that it's usually easier to use fractions instead of decimals. So let me redo this question, but with fractions instead. Okay, I know that 8 scones, I need 225 grams of flour, right? So to make 1, instead of doing 28.5, I'm just gonna do 225 over 8. And then now I just times by 20, because that's essentially what I did there. I can do a bit of cancelling here, so this will become 2 and this will become 5. And then what I would end up with is, if I have some space for it down here, I'll end up with 1125 over 2. Now in this example, less so, it's not that useful, but the main reason for doing this is because you're not left with these long trails of decimal points. So 28.125, 562.5. These cases, they're terminating decimals, so they're fairly easy to remember. But if you ever come across recurring decimals, they can be a nightmare to get down and remember. So it's simply easier to use fractions in most cases. Saying this, if you prefer using decimals and that's the method that you really want to use, then we can't stop you. It's always a matter of what works best for you. So now we've got a distance, speed, time question. This is a relatively simple one, but it just demonstrates the importance. Make sure you remember the equation. Go back. Remember the equation: distance equals speed times time. So I'm just gonna keep this up here because I definitely will need it later on. So mail is being delivered to the local post office in Donington for distribution the next day. The delivery van travels at an average speed of 54 miles per hour and is leaving the main distribution center in Buton at 6:50 a.m. That's important. And the distance is 44 kilometers. So you'll notice here we've got a speed and we've got a distance. With a speed and distance, we can work out time, which is exactly what the question wants us to do. So time is distance over speed, and we won't touch that just yet because there's another step that we have to do. You'll notice that we've got different units for our speed and our distance here, but we are in fact given a conversion factor, so we should probably convert them to the same units before we can work it out. A time, let's convert to miles per hour just because just for the sake of it. Distance 44 kilometers divided by 1.6 is 27.5 miles. So I've got a calculator. You can do this on a calculator too, if you like, in the actual exam. And now we've got 2 units in miles that we can use directly to calculate speed. So if I just did this properly, 27.5 over 4054, all you'll find is we end up with a time of 31 minutes. Now, you might be thinking this doesn't match any of our answer options. That's just because we need to do a bit more interpretation. The delivery starts at 6:50. We add 31 minutes to it. We just end up with 7:21. So that's basically speed, distance, time. Remember the equation. When you have 2 variables, you can work out the third is the main premise of this question type. Let's see what else. So now we've got geometry question. This one, at face, it looks very difficult because of the fact that you have a huge irregular shape. But upon further inspection, you can just see these are fairly simple. This is a compound shape, and these are very simple shapes. Like this is a square, rectangle, rectangle. So nothing to be scared of. Let's read the question. The diagram below shows the floor plan of Gracie's new house, which she bought last week. She is redecorating and is looking into different colors for the carpets of the flooring of the house. So this is assumedly the floor plan. And down here, we get told the table shows the prices per meter squared for different colors of the carpet, and C is a perfect square. Our question then is, Gracie is quoted 240 for the cost of light brown carpet in room C, but how much of an overestimate is this? So quite clearly, we're interested in room C. And we have the length, let's say. You might be thinking we don't have the width, but actually, if you pay close attention, this question bit down here that tells us C is a perfect square means that this would also have to be 4.1, since the length and width have to be the same. So when it comes to calculating the area of C, we simply have to do 4.1 times 4.1, and that gives us 16.81 meters squared. Our job isn't done though. We're told to calculate the cost of applying light brown carpet. So again, we just have to refer to this table, multiply that by the cost per meter squared of light brown carpet, and we end with a value, I think, of £231 and 98 pence. So again, you'll say this doesn't match any of our answers, but just a quick reinterpretation of this question stem says she was quoted £240 when the actual cost was £231.98. And how much of an estimate is this? A simple subtraction will give us 240 minus that, and it will give us £8 2 pence. So again, just breaking things down in geometry, just a more reasonable and approachable things to do. And for our last example, we've got a percentage change question. So let's have a look at the graphs. We've got 2 bar charts. One shows the table average salary by industry, and then one shows average salary by years of experience. And it just says here, the graphs below show information collected by a government agency responsible for jobs in the United Kingdom. So this isn't that important at all. We should be focusing more on this bit here. Tom recently moved from a job in education to financial services. Assuming he earned the average salary, what is the percentage difference in his earnings? So there's nothing in here mentioned about experience or time of experience at all. So we can completely ignore this graph here for now. We're more interested in this first one. And in particular, we're looking at the salary for education jobs, which is 25,000, and financial services jobs, which is 35,000. And we're asking to say, what is the percentage difference in his earnings? Now, there is a very specific formula you must use for percentage change. The way it works is I'll write it like this, and I'll explain what each one is. So V2 represents the new value, and V1 represents the old value. So you might have seen this before as new minus old over old. But essentially, the way this percentage change formula works is you take the new value, you subtract the old value from it, and you divide everything by the old value, multiplying by 100 to get your percentage change. That's just the specific order. If you got V1 and V2 the wrong way around, you would end up with an inverse percentage change, which isn't what you want. So if we put this in the context of the question, Tom started in education and he moved financial services. So V1 in this case, the old value, would be 25,000, and his new value would be V2, which is 35,576. So what we do for the percentage change is 35,576 minus 25,000 over 25,000, and then we multiply this by 100. And this gives us somewhere in the region of 42% percentage change. And that we can attribute directly to this answer here. Now, really quickly, I want to mention, when you're using this percentage change formula, it's important to note that any positive percentage change you get suggests that there's been a percentage increase in the values, whereas any negative percentage change values you get suggests there's been a percentage decrease. So if instead you get asked about percentage increase and decrease, just be aware about the sign in front of the value that you calculate here. So in this case, it's a plus, and therefore it's an increase. And that makes sense since we go from 25,000 to 35,000. And that's quantitative reasoning done, I think. Right, and now we have to move on to abstract reasoning. This is a section that a lot of people don't like because it's relatively new, but it's known as the shape recognition, or this is the shape section, simply because there's so many shapes involved, and I'm sure many of you are grown tired of the practice involved with them. But this section most importantly tests your ability to identify patterns from abstract shapes. And to do this effectively, you need to be able to track the small changes, the big changes, and then develop these ideas about possible patterns, test these ideas, and then change your approach if they're right or wrong. So this will be the section that most people ask, how is this relevant to health-based careers? And it's difficult to say, but it's linked to the way that you answer the questions in this section. You have this repeating process of looking at seemingly unlinked objects, trying to find a pattern between them, testing the pattern in different cases, and then trying another pattern if the first one didn't work. This process of finding patterns, testing new ones, and is similar in a way to creating critically evaluating hypotheses in science-based careers. So you're always saying, okay, does this work? Let's test it. If it doesn't work, let's go with something else. And the most common example you'll probably see in textbooks and websites is that medical practitioners will have to identify possible diagnoses for a patient when presented with a different number of symptoms. And in this case, the shapes represent the symptoms, and the link you find is the diagnosis. So you can choose to believe it or not, but it's just what they tend to do. In this question section, we have 55 questions to answer in 13 minutes. So this is the most time-pressured section. And we should get straight onto it. So in these 55 questions, you have 4 main question types. Type 1 will present you with 2 individual sets of shapes labeled A and set B, and each of these sets contains 6 boxes that each contain a group of abstract shapes. So this will make a lot more sense when we show you the images and the worked examples, but within each of these sets, all the shapes will share a common pattern. And then let's say if set A has a pattern, set B will have a related but slightly different pattern. Your job for the type 1 questions is to make sure that you can identify the pattern and then see if you can apply that pattern on a test shape given to you, so you can determine whether that shape would actually belong to set A, set B, or neither. Again, this is all really abstract for now, but it'll make a lot more sense when we go through the worked examples. Type 2 is a complete the series type question. So what I mean by this is you'll be given 4 boxes that progress in logical progression, and then you'll containing shapes. Each of these boxes will contain shapes that change slightly as you move from left to right, and your job will be to try and identify what the 5th box would look like from a series of options. Type 3 is kind of an unfinished statement one. You get given 3 boxes that say A is to B as X is to Y. Now you'll be given A, B, and X. So the important thing is for you to interpret the pattern change from A to B, and then your job is to then apply the pattern change from X to Y. And once you've done that, you can select the appropriate answer option from the ones that are given to you. And then type 4 is which shape belongs to set A or set B. So this is very, very similar to the type 1 questions in the sense that you'll be given set A or set B with 6 boxes each and a pattern. But instead of having to choose or prove whether the given test shape it belongs to set A or set B, you'll be given a statement that says which one of the following shapes belongs to either set A, set B, or neither, and then you'll be asked to pick from a series of test shapes. Again, it's all abstract right now, but it will make a lot more sense when we go through some worked examples. Now, exam advice for abstract reasoning. This is probably the most important part to do well in the UCAT. Simply, so the most important advice to take in the UCAT, simply because stuff like abstract reasoning, this section is something that they're very unlikely to have come across before, unless maybe you've done the 11 plus if you're in Kent. But yeah, identifying shapes, you've probably never really actively done it before doing the UCAT practice. But we'll start by talking about identifying patterns. Ultimately, the approach for all 4 question types in this section is to be able to identify the patterns, linking the shapes, and then applying that pattern in a way to choose the correct answer. There are many different ways, many different things to look out for, but always start by trying to look for the simple patterns in the boxes of each set before you move on to more complex relationships. If you're struggling to look for things, then you can use this. You can try and use this. I forgot what it's called. You could try and use this acronym called SCANS to help you remind yourself of what you should be looking out for. So SCANS, we've got here, it stands for shape, color, arrangement, number, and size. Whenever you see a test shape, you should go through, or if you don't have anything else to check, go through each one of these letters and words and try and look out for the simple aspects of these things, and see if that leads you anywhere. There are lots of different questions you can be asking in each shape. For example, for shape, you can say, are all of the objects the same shape? Do they all contain right angles? Any lines of symmetry? Color, obviously, is looking more at shading. Which objects have shading? Is there shading at all? Arrangement talks about, let's say, do any of the shapes overlap? Which shapes are inside others? Which shape are parallel to others, and so on. Number is fairly obvious, and size, again, fairly obvious. Number, how many things there are, how big are they? So SCANS is a way for you to identify patterns. And unfortunately, the best advice we can give for abstract reasoning sounds very generic, and it's just to try and do as much practice as you can. Now, there is reason for this. It's not just because practice helps. It's because once you have identified a pattern for the first time in your practice, you're more likely to be aware of that pattern if you ever come across it again. Let's say there was a pattern with intersecting lines that you came across and struggled on. If you got that wrong in practice, that's fine. It's better you didn't get it wrong in the actual exam. And you might find that next time in the actual exam, you see a pattern with lines, you say, okay, I've come across this before. It seems unlikely, but the more practice you do, the more times you'll be able to say, okay, I've seen this pattern before and I can apply it, or I can check for it using this acronym SCANS. And aside from that, the practice is really good for just identifying patterns quickly, good for the time element of this section, because really the time element is what hurts a lot of people and the scores in this section. So it's all about getting used to the format and the question types that come up here. So we have next, we're going to talk a bit about distractors. Distractors are shapes or elements of shapes that do not fit in with any of the patterns shown in the boxes, and essentially they are there to throw you off. They're trying to stop you from finding the pattern. They're somewhat rare, but when they do show up, if you're too focused on looking for specific things or you're struggling to find things, they can end up making things worse. And where possible, if you see something that doesn't match up at all with your other patterns, don't immediately discard your pattern that worked for 5 things. Just try and be conscious of the fact that things are there to throw you off as well. And now these 2 methods, focusing and stepping back, they kind of go hand in hand, but we'll go through them together. When I say focusing in, I'm talking about, let's say you're given a box with like 20 shapes. Focusing in, we want you to focus on one shape or feature at a time. This will help you find really, really small changes and patterns that are normally less obvious than if you're looking at them like at face value. So by focusing in, you can look for things like that you wouldn't otherwise notice. For example, a small change in color or a small change in shading. And this is most applicable for type 2 and type 3 questions, where you will find there's a progressive change for each of the boxes. It's relatively slow to use, to be honest, for question stems containing many boxes. So if you've got set A and set B questions, so type 1, type 4, we don't really recommend doing this simply because it takes a lot of time to zoom in and look at the different parts of a shape or different parts of a box. But for ones with fewer boxes, so that's type 3 and type 4, these work great. They help you find small changes, which in turn help you build up to the more complex and less obvious ones. Now, whilst it's important to focus in on specific features, it's also really important for you to step back sometimes. When you've got lots of shapes or lots of boxes of shapes, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. So taking a step back, you can really just try not, first of all, relax, and second of all, you can become more likely to spot the simple patterns that you might have missed when you were looking for the more complex ones. For example, things that are often associated with number and size, you tend to miss out when you're trying to focus on some difficult patterns. But when you step back, you see, oh wait, there's always a black circle in the bottom left corner, or there's always a white square in the top right corner. These are things that you'll start seeing more if you step back. And really, it's a mixture of focusing in and stepping back at the right time when you do different questions. Sometimes it works better for other people than others, but by all means, while you're practicing, give them a go. Try, if you're struggling, focusing on a specific aspect, or if you're struggling, step back a bit and try and look for what might be more obvious that you might have missed from the things. So these are our main points for abstract reasoning. We're going to try and put them into practice with some worked examples now. So we've got a type 1 example here, denoted by the two sets of shapes available, and then we get asked, does this test shape belong to set A, set B, or neither? Now, spoiler alert, there's already the answer here, but we're going to go through the scans process together anyway. So scans, we begin with shape. Well, I'm going to look at both sets, and I'll say, in each set, there's a circle, there's a square, and there's a few lines. That's it. I don't want to go any deeper now. I just want to go for the simple ones, just try and find anything I can. In color, I'll say, okay, well, sometimes there's a black shape, and then sometimes there's a white shape. Well, there's one black shape and one white shape each time. And we look at the arrangement, we can see, okay, the black shape's always inside of the white shape each time. So we're slowly gradually building up this progressive idea of a pattern. So set A, we've got, or both set A and set B, a black shape inside a white shape. Number, well, there's always one white shape, one black shape, and then a number of lines. If you want, you can now start counting the lines. So there's 2 lines here, there's 4 lines here, there's 1, 2, 3 lines here. There's nothing we can really get out from this. So maybe we don't check too deep into the numbers, right? And then size again. Well, it's fairly inconsistent based on size, but we can always tell that the shape inside must, by logic, be smaller than the shape on the outside. Okay, so what we've got so far is that there's always a shape inside another one, and that shape's dark. Well, let's build a bit on it. Let's see. If we pay attention to these shapes, we start zooming into what's inside of them, we can see that, okay, in every case in set A, this shape is a square. Now, if we look over at set B, you can see every shape in the inside is a circle, and the outside is a square. So actually, this is what I mean when I say this inverse pattern. Every shape, every box in set A has a white circle and a small black square inside it. Conversely, every shape in set B has a white square and a black circle inside it. But that's not everything. We've got a few lines as well. You might be tempted to think these are distractors. It's very possible that they could be distractors, but if you've got time, it's worth a check anyway, because this could lose your mark, just throwing you off. So we looked at the numbers of sticks there are, or lines, sorry, and we couldn't find anything. But let's try looking at the intersects, because that's part of arrangement, right? Here we've got 1, here we've got 3, here we've got 3, here we've got 5, 1, and 5 here. So very similar numbers, 1, 3, 5 appear a lot, and then if you pay attention, you'll realize these are all odd numbers. Now, if you look at the right side, you see these are all actually even numbers, and that this is in fact the next part of the pattern. There are 2 main parts. 1, an odd number of intersects for the lines on this side, and 2, a black square inside a white circle. So that's inverse for set B, but now we've got those rules, we can apply them to this one. So we've got a small black circle inside a white square. This suggests that it could be in set B, but remember, we have to check for the intersects. There's 1 here, and we know that all the intersects in here must have 2. So it doesn't make sense. This can't be in set B, so it therefore must be in neither. That's a really drawn-out thinking process about how we can tackle this type of question. But when you practice, it's more of a case of just doing this, but getting really fast at it, being able to do this all in a very short space of time. And realistically, even though there are 55 questions, you have to remember, for each set like this, you'll be given 5 smaller questions like this. So once you find the pattern, you can answer the next 4 questions fairly quickly. So that's something to hopefully reassure you if you think 55 questions in 30 minutes is very difficult. So here we've got a type 2 question. We've got a progression of shapes from left to right here, and we've got a number of things that could complete the series over here. Let's begin by looking at what we've got. So if we tried scans, well, we've got a corner piece. I'm just going to call this corner piece, and we've got another shape in the center. So that's our shape. Color, well, the corner piece is always black, but this seems fairly consistent, right? In the arrangement, this corner piece seems, well, it occupies a corner, hence the name corner piece, but it seems to be rotating, right? We'll keep that in mind for now. Now, number, there's always one corner piece and then one shape in the middle. There's nothing much to say about that. And its size doesn't seem to change particularly, but this is much bigger than the piece in the center. So from that, we didn't actually get that much information. So in this case, scans wasn't that helpful. But we can try on other methods, you know, like zooming in. So instead of looking at this as a whole, I want to just look at this corner piece in each case. Here, it occupies the top left. Here, it occupies the bottom left. Here, bottom right. And then here, top right. If I'm ignoring the centerpiece, you can kind of see the progression. This is actually rotating counterclockwise. So again, ignoring the centerpiece, this is our first point. We now know that in our fifth box, it will probably, not for sure, but probably end up in the top left corner. So we're looking at this one, we're looking at this one, we're looking at this one. Now, in a normal context, if you were pressed for time, now would be a good time to guess one of these three options and proceed, because it's important for you to not spend too much or linger wasting too much time on these questions. And after all, a 1 in 3 chance of getting a question right is much better than a 1 in 4 chance of getting a question right. So don't be hesitant to guess. But we do have time in this case, so we're just going to quickly go through the rest of it. We're going to now look at this, focusing on this shape here, this center shape. When we look at the actual shape itself, we can see it's a rectangle here, or a vertical rectangle here, then a triangle here, a vertical rectangle here, and a triangle here. By this pattern, we can see it's alternating. We could probably assume that it'll be a vertical rectangle at the end too. So if we just clear everything, we know that it'll be a corner piece in the top left and a vertical rectangle. So out of our 4 options, we narrowed it down to 2. Again, if you want to guess, now is a good time, because 1 in 2 is a very good chance to get it right. And it saves you time for other questions, but we're not done yet. We can get more accurate. So we're going to zoom in one more time on the same shape, but instead of looking at the shape itself, we're going to look at the color. Here it's kind of shaded. Here it's kind of black, and here it's kind of white. Then here we go back to shaded. If we look at just this progression, we can assume that in the next shape, if we follow this pattern, shaded, black, white, shaded, black again. So we can assume that whatever it's going to be a black vertical rectangle with a top left corner piece, and that fits our description perfectly down here. So in this case, we just pick this one. Again, that takes a lot of time. So you don't want to spend too much time on these questions. It's all about manual practicing until you get fast enough with doing it. And yeah, so this is type 2. We're going to quickly move on to type 3 question here. So this is one of the harder ones. Again, like type 2, it takes a longer time for you to do, but essentially you're going to be working on completing this statement. Here we've got one box, and another box, a third box, and a fourth box. Your job is to pick the right box that goes here. So it goes here essentially. Sorry. So let's try and look for patterns here. Shape. Well, we've got 3 shapes here. You've got a triangle, a square, and a circle. A square, a circle, and a triangle. So the shapes haven't changed, right? All you'll notice is the triangle has rotated 90 degrees. That's something we should pay attention to. Now, in terms of the arrangement, you'll also notice that the triangle has come outward. So it begins in the innermost shape, but it ends up the outermost shape, and then causing, therefore, the circle and the square to become inside. We've just looked at specific bits of this triangle, just focused in on this triangle here, and we've learned quite a lot. So let's try to find those rules to this bit here. So triangle rotate 90 degrees, so we expect the triangle to look something like that. And then this innermost thing should come outside. So we end up with a circle and then probably a hexagon in the middle like this. And if you look at the answer options, that fits this perfectly. So again, it's just a matter of focusing in on small bits, trying to apply that thing yourself. So yeah, we'll go to the next type here. Here, a type 4 question. Like I said, it's really, really similar to type 1 questions. In the sense that you get given the same information, right? But the question you get asked is slightly different. So instead of does the test shape belong to set A, B, or neither, you get asked which one of the following shapes belong to set A. Sometimes it's which one belongs to set B and which one belongs to neither. So it's all about a case of being able to identify these quickly. So This is one of the ones where if you focused in, you could do scans. You could look at like shape, color, arrangement, number, size. You could say, well, there's 2 circles, 5 circles, 4 circles, 2 circles, 3 circles, and you could pin yourself with doing all of this with a lot of time. But this is one of the times where I'd say, since there's so many things, it doesn't hurt to step back a bit. Step back and look what you've got. And if you've realized by now, you'll see these are actually just dominoes. They are, but to be pedantic, they're squares and black circles, but they are dominoes. And with dominoes, you know you can count them. So here we've got 1, 1, and we've got a total of 2, right? Here we've got 5, 4, and a total of 9. Here we've got 3, 2, and a total of 5. So if I just do this and I write the totals only, 2, 9, 5, 1, 6, and 6, what you'll notice is that we're developing this pattern where if it's even numbers, it's horizontal, and if it's odd numbers, it's vertical. You can try looking for a pattern B, or you'll notice it's just the inverse. So even numbers are vertical, whereas odd numbers are horizontal. So in this case, finding the pattern for B wasn't that useful because we're looking only for the shapes that belong to A. But we can now apply the knowledge we have to look for the ones. And here we've got an example of a total with even numbers, and that's horizontal. So this matches our group A thing perfectly. Right, so that's it for abstract reasoning. We're now going to talk about situational judgment, which is traditionally one of the harder bits. So this section is all about your judgment skills and being able to weigh up factors in a situation. You're going to be presented a scenario and a series of 4 to 5 questions based on the scenario, or up to 6 sometimes too. But essentially, these will be all based on ethical dilemmas where there's no clear answer that should be done, but a series of different factors that you should always consider. There are 69 questions in this topic, in this section, sorry, and 26 minutes to answer them. That does mean you have an incredibly, it does appear to be an incredibly time-strained thing, but when you do it yourself, you'll actually probably find that these questions, the timing isn't as bad as you think or as it appears. So let's go into the question types. There are 2 main question types. Well, like we said, all of them are based off doing scenarios. So you'll be given a short paragraph saying you're, say, a medical student doing this, this, this. Something happens, and you're now looking at responses. Well, there's 2 types of questions that can come up. Well, first one is appropriateness questions. These ones essentially give you a potential solution or an action that you can perform, and they ask you to judge the appropriateness of that action. So you have 4 options. You can either say it's very appropriate, not ideal but appropriate, inappropriate but not awful, and very inappropriate. So a very appropriate thing to do means that the proposed action would be a great response because you directly resolve the situation without any detrimental effects. Now, appropriate but not ideal means the proposed action should be done because it may slightly improve the situation, but it may not necessarily be the best thing available because there might be like a minor drawback or 2. Inappropriate but not awful things, probably you ideally would avoid them because it could still lead to some undesirable outcomes, but the negative consequences of this action may be so minor to a point where it wouldn't be completely unacceptable to do these. And then very inappropriate, these things should just be avoided at all costs because they probably make the situation much worse and are borderline dangerous for people. That's appropriateness. For your importance questions, it's kind of similar, but instead of judging the appropriateness of actions, you're judging the importance of different factors. So, for example, you'll be given a factor like this. How important is this factor to consider when you're tackling the situation? Very important means that the factor is absolutely essential and you should not ignore it in any circumstance. Important means while the factor is still significant in the scenario and it should ideally be accounted for, there are cases where it's not as important as very important factors. Minor importance means it's somewhat relevant, but it doesn't matter too much if you miss it. And not important at all means it's not relevant to the situation. You can ignore this. In fact, most times you should ignore it because it would be detrimental to account for them. Now, with those question types out of the way, we'll talk a bit about the exam advice and preparation you should do. There are a lot of recurring themes about in situation judgment, and they're based off maintaining patient safety and making sure that you make professional decisions, right? Taking this into mind, one of the most important or one of the best sources of information you can find about this is the General Medical Council and their documents they've released about the ethical guidance that doctors should follow. It sounds like a very long read, but reading the most important one, I'd say, is good medical practice. Reading that document, it's around 80 bullet points of things that you should and shouldn't do in specific situations, and that it's like a primer. It really helps you understand what you should do in textbook situations, what you shouldn't do in textbook situations. It's not going to help you get full marks, but it definitely gives you a really good understanding of the thought processes, the ideas, and the values that doctors should try to maintain when answering things. And after all, this is a situational judgment section where you are expected to uphold the values important to healthcare professionals and make the right decisions. So where else to gain that information than the organization that actually is in charge of all the doctors in the UK? So considering, there are a lot of factors you should consider. The ones we've listed are authority, confidentiality, help, honesty, legality, mistakes, stress, and teamwork. Now I'm over the time, so I'm going to rush through each of these, but they're all covered in more detail in our ebook. So authority is just important to pay attention to what the ranking essentially of the person involved. If you're a medical student, you have to normally listen to your superiors. Don't try and upset them. You're not allowed to legally give healthcare advice, and you're not allowed to prescribe medication. That's just an example. You could be a consultant in which case you have more responsibility. For confidentiality, this is basically making sure you protect patient information. It doesn't get leaked. It shouldn't be leaked. And in most cases, you should be doing your utmost best to protect it. Help. This is the idea that sometimes you should be willing to ask for help from others if you feel like your workload is too much in some situations, and not being afraid to ask for help from superiors if you're in a situation that's difficult. Honesty is just a simple value that you should always uphold in usually all walks of life, but particularly in medicine, because as a medical student or a practitioner, you're expected to uphold the integrity of the medical field. So the GMC outlines that you should always try and uphold these values. Legality, obviously, in the most basic sense, you should stick to the law. You should never do anything that should break the law, and these tend to be like easy marks for you to get in the exam. Mistakes. When I say mistakes, I don't mean mistakes in getting questions wrong. I mean, you might do something that you shouldn't have in a hospital setting, or you might have messed up on a piece of group work in a presentation, let's say in a setting. In all these cases, it's always important to admit the mistake and try and rectify the mistake to the best as you can. Never trying to hide the mistake or ignore the mistake's effects is usually the worst thing you can do. So yeah, don't do that. Stress. You probably all know by now that medicine and dentistry are both very stressful, can be very stressful healthcare professions. So it's important for you to be able to balance your stress and your work and life balance, if that makes sense. When you're stressed, you can end up making mistakes or bad decisions that can end up compromising your own well-being or your safety and patient safety. So that's the primary focus, patient safety, right? So never pick options that end up making the person seem more stressed, or always go for options that can help the person de-stress. And then teamwork, another key value that you should always uphold, simply because of how important it is to allied health professionals in general. Now, what I put here, doing what you should do and not what you would do. When presented these scenarios, you should always keep in mind that this is a test and that they want to see that you know what should be done in each situation. They don't really want to know what you would do in a different situation, because in some cases, you might not agree with the answer. You might personally believe that you should do something else. But at the end of the day, it's a test and you should be going for the maximum marks. So try and always answer to what you think should be done, not what you actually would do in real life. And the scoring in bands, we've covered this lightly, but instead of being awarded a score from 300 to 900 for situational judgment, you're given a band from 1 to 4. And essentially, what this means is your score, every right answer, every wrong answer, and every partially correct answer gets translated to a raw value. We don't know how it's calculated, but the best performing people get in band 1, then the next best batch is band 2, and working way it's down to band 4. They're calculated in a way that every year, roughly, you get a similar number of people in each band, but the bands in situation judgment are something that a lot of universities will pay attention to. For example, if you get band 4, unfortunately, a lot of universities will not want to interview you. Whereas if you get band 1, then a lot of universities some of them will expect you to get band 1, and some of them would rather you get band 1 for the application. So that's just a quick run through of the bands. Now we've got a quick example to run through. We've got 2 examples to run through. The first one is the appropriateness one. So I'm just quickly read through this. Aaron is a junior doctor, so first thing to highlight, working in a busy hospital. He's working alongside a fellow junior doctor, Emma. Aaron has noticed that Emma has poor time management and struggles to get through her assigned workload. Sometimes she looks panicked and distracted, and Aaron often has to pick up her tasks to ensure the job is done. However, Emma is very likable and can complete the task diligently when given instructions. How appropriate is the following response by Aaron to raise Emma's behavior with the senior supervisor? Now, we have to understand the setting first. It's a busy hospital. There are patients everywhere. That's what that busy hospital means. And you're two junior doctors, right? The implication of being a busy hospital, that when Emma makes these panics and distracted states, or when she makes these mistakes or doesn't get through her assigned workload, there is a very, very real chance that patient's safety could be compromised. It's unlikely, since Emma's a junior doctor, so she probably won't be given important tasks compared to a consultant, but it's still a chance that patient's safety can be compromised, and in that sense, you really want to tackle the situation where possible. So the question asks, is it appropriate to raise Emma's behavior with a senior supervisor? In a sense, yes. So in this top half, we're saying yes. In this bottom half, we're essentially saying no. We're saying yes because this is a thing we can't ignore, Aaron cannot ignore, sorry. It's better to tell the senior supervisor because of the fact he is a senior supervisor. He can help you and he can give these direct instructions to Emma. It's not like you're telling her off by reporting it to the senior supervisor. If anything, Aaron is trying to help Emma by reporting it to a senior supervisor. Now, the reason why it's not very appropriate is because this is assuming that this is the only thing you've done. You've only gone to the senior supervisor and you've not consulted with Emma first. Ideally, you should always talk to the person involved first. In this case, Aaron should talk to Emma about her behavior, if she needs any help or if she can improve it, before he raises it with the supervisor. So this can be seen as unnecessary escalation. If you want, a better thing to have done is to talk to Emma directly about it before talking to the supervisor. But given the circumstance of a busy hospital that's potentially dangerous, raising it with a senior supervisor right now isn't necessarily bad either. So that's appropriateness. And here we've got an important one. Jamie is a 5th-year medical student having dinner with a few of her friends in a busy restaurant. So, busy restaurant, not quite a hospital, but it's a restaurant. Jamie's friends begin discussing patients they've been seeing or on a placement, and a couple times identifying details are mentioned. Jamie notices a few of the other guests in the restaurant are looking around at them. How important are the following considerations to take into account by Jamie when deciding how to respond to the situation? It is unlikely that anyone in the restaurant knows the patients mentioned. So essentially, what this question is asking you is, how important is it that it is unlikely anyone in the restaurant actually knows the patients mentioned, and how would that affect your decision to respond? Or Jamie's decision to respond, sorry. Well, a very tempting thing to do is to say important or very important, because if the people in the restaurant don't know the patients they're talking about, then really you don't really care because no one's really in harm here. But as a matter of principle, something that's stated in the good medical practice, the GMC's good medical practice, or just in general, patient confidentiality is incredibly important. And whenever there's a breach in patient confidentiality, in this case, it's Jamie's friends discussing patients' information, you should always do your best to stop it as fast as possible. So it doesn't matter at all if no one knows the patients involved. This is something that shouldn't be happening in the first place. So you should do your best to stop it. You should not hesitate because no one knows the patients involved. It doesn't matter if one of the patients involved is a best friend of people in the restaurant or if they've never met them in their life. The principle is still that they're doing something they shouldn't be at all. And you shouldn't, or Jamie shouldn't hesitate in reacting to stop it. So this is really just exemplifies how serious things like confidentiality are. It's something that should be protected at all times, and there are very, very few cases where you're allowed to really quote unquote breach confidentiality. So yeah, that's for the importance question. Again, this is only one factor. You might get 3 to 4, maybe up to 5 or 6 factors for each scenario. But as you can see, once you've read the scenario, answering the factors doesn't take too long. So even though you've got 69 questions, it's not too bad. So that is the bulk of our content done. We've now got time for a really short Q&A section where you can ask us questions in the chat and we'll try and answer them. So feel free to do any questions in the chat. If you don't have any questions, I've got a few UCAT FAQs to go through, frequently asked questions that people usually have to talk through instead. But let's see. Do you get marks for partially correct answers? Yes, you do actually. So I'll quickly go back and show you how that works. So let's say in this example, the correct answer is not important at all. We know this because that's what the mark scheme says. If you put of minor importance instead of not important, you get partial marks, right? And what that means is even though you don't get the full mark, you will still get credit for doing something similar to it. So that's why we've got 4 different bands. With the 4 different bands, you should try and get full marks where possible, but partial marks is a lot better than getting no marks at all. So as always, yeah, go for full marks, but if you can't, it's not bad to get partially correct answers. They do contribute to your markings. When should you start doing the mocks? Well, wherever is comfortable for you. It depends on how long you're preparing for. So if you're preparing for, let's say, 4 weeks, I'd say maybe the last week and a half, but it should ideally not be too long, because what tends to happen is you run out of mocks to do, or you end up burning out. So don't try and cram too many mocks in at once. But from personal experience, I prepared 8 weeks, so I spent the last 2 weeks doing mocks. Generally, the last quarter of your preparation, if you save that for mocks, that's quite a good thing to do. A safe ballpark figure, really. But yeah, whenever you're ready for them is not bad either. If the SJT is banded on actually, do you have to answer all the questions? You don't have to. You don't have to strictly answer all the questions. You don't have to answer all the questions for any section at all, actually. But you should always try and answer them, because even if you don't know the what it could be, or even if you run out of time, answering them will give you a better chance of getting a mark than not answering them at all, so to speak. So yeah, always try and answer your questions if you can. Obviously, the more accurate you are, the higher band you get. So, or the lower band you get, but the better band you get. Sorry. Will we get a similar crash course for the BMAT? Yes, actually, we will. We're planning on one now, and actually, we'll talk more about it in a bit. So I'll come back to that. Would you say 3 weeks of revision is enough? The preparation time for each person varies, so it really depends on how you study or how intensely you study in those 3 weeks. If you are doing a lot of practice, or if you're used to the skills already required in the UCAT, then you'll find that probably 3 weeks is enough. As long as you make sure you work on your technique, you do your mocks before the thing, you should be able to get a score you're happy with. But we tend to get the question a lot: is XYZ enough time? And really, it's more of it probably is. If it's just bigger, it's better to make use of the time you have now than panicking that you don't have enough time, essentially. What do you think is the biggest mistake that students make while revising for the UCAT? Honestly, it's probably not reflecting on the practice enough. What tends to happen is you get people who do like thousands of questions and they end up not performing well, and they're like, what happened? Well, the thing is, if you're getting every single like probability question right, there's no reason for you to keep practicing probability. Likewise, if you're getting every single logic question wrong, you should be practicing more logic questions and trying to look for it out. So making sure you're reflecting on your practice and being mindful with your practice, making sure you're making the best of the time you have and not just wasting it mindlessly doing thousands of questions that you probably don't need to be doing. So what I'd say the biggest mistake is not focusing your revision and not reflecting. Will we get a recording of this? Yes, we're currently recording all of this, so we will shortly make it available on our website. Because of the length of it, will take a while to upload though. So it'll take a while. How do I know if my UCAT score is strong for an application? Right, well, we'll cover this in a moment with our strategic application guide, but essentially later in the year, the UCAT consortium releases a statistics report, which basically lists all the scores of the UCAT, basically, and ranks them in deciles. A decile is basically a group of 10% of the students, and then you can see, let's say, for example, what the top 10% of scorers got. So let's say the top decile was 3,200, let's say, and then that means that anyone who got 3,200 or higher was in the top 10%. So usually comparing it to the deciles is a good way to know for how well you did in UCAT. But we'll also touch on some strategic application guides that will tell you how good it is for specific unis in a bit. So we'll get onto that just now, actually. You are probably wondering now what's next. Well, most of you will know that the UCAT only forms a small part of your application cycle. and that there are still many other things you have to prepare for before you submit your application on UCAS. So we at Edify are really committed to helping you every step along the way with these applications, because we know how difficult it can be to do them by yourself. We're currently working on some other resources that you'll be able to access in the future. So firstly, we received 100 followers on Instagram, and we have everyone here in this call to thank for that. So we really wanted to say a big thank you to everyone by offering a giveaway. This giveaway features the opportunity to get a free personal statement review and a Q&A session with our Oxford and Imperial Med students about absolutely any part of your application. To be eligible for the giveaway, we just ask that you do 3 things for us: to join one of our WhatsApp group chats, to follow Edify Learning on Instagram, and then just to like and comment on each of our posts, tagging at least 3 other people in your comment. For every one of your people that you tag that follows us, you also receive an extra entry in your name. And we'll do this giveaway. We'll be drawing winners in 2 weeks, so we'll let you know as soon as possible. We're also close to completing our strategic application ebook for medicine. And essentially, what this means is that what this guide is for is that it will tell you all the UCAT cutoffs, all the BMAT cutoffs, and all the scores of applicants who applied to every single medical school last year for 2021 entry. And what we hope to do with this is to give you the information that you need to be able to look at your UCAT score, to look at your application, your predicted grade, and say, okay, I can comfortably apply to this university and know that I have a fairly good chance of getting in, or getting an interview, sorry. So when I saw a question earlier about how do I know if I've got a good UCAT strong for an application, how do I know if my UCAT score is strong for an application? We're going to try and release that as soon as possible. On that topic, we're also releasing free one-to-one strategic application consultations, where essentially one of us is going to go through your application with you, discuss with you about which university your application should be best for based on what you've scored, your personal statement, and all that. So do keep a lookout for that. Again, these are all free, so keep a lookout for those. Another thing to mention is on the topic of strategic applications, if you prefer video formats instead of like ebooks and consultations, then please visit someone called Ruler the Medic, who is currently working hard on some YouTube and Instagram videos about applying strategically to universities. She's received an offer from UCL, and she really knows a lot about the admission cycle in general. So she's a great, friendly, and reliable source of information that you can contact if you want more information about strategic application. Then, as we approach the start of the academic year again, we'll be opening up live A-level maths, biology, chemistry, and physics lessons to help cover areas that you may want more help in for future mocks and so on. But if you're not a fan of the A-level group sessions, then we'll also be offering one-to-one paid tuition as well, where you have like a more opportunity for direct and focused teaching. In response to one of the questions earlier, we are planning to run a free BMAT crash course as well this year in a very similar style, where we go through obviously exam content, questions, and worked examples. But we'll be basing it a lot on the feedback we get from this one. So if you're still here, then I'll talk about some more feedback later on, but for now, we'll just continue this one. And group interview practice. When in far future, when fingers crossed you all have your full offers, full interview invitations, we'll be preparing group interview practice tutorials where we'll be teaching skills for different formats of interviews. So that's MMI and panel interviews. And then you have a chance to practice these skills with us by asking questions, answering questions, and asking other applicants who are applying to similar universities as you. For all of these things we're planning on offering, you'll be able to find more information for them in the email you receive after today's presentation. So please feel free to have a further look there. If you're interested in any of the things that we're planning on offering soon, then please don't hesitate to get in contact with us. On the screen, you'll see our email, our Instagram, and our Facebook, which you can visit to stay updated with our different resources that we're offering soon. And although we're planning to release all our free ebooks on our website eventually, we just want to quickly point out that they will be exclusively available for our Instagram followers around a week or two before we release them publicly on our website. So if you'd like, you can follow us on Instagram to get this early access, and we tend to release most of our messages here anyway, so it's definitely worth to follow. And outside of these social media platforms, you can also get involved in our growing communities by joining our WhatsApp group chat for medicine and dentistry applicants. Here we've got lots of people. You'll be able to meet other applicants and share advice or news on your application, and everyone's more than welcome to join. Quite recently, we've got a lot of people just going through and talking about different tips and tricks that they're doing for the UCAT questions, as well as different examples that people need help on. So that's always there. And moreover, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to just rate our service provider today on Trustpilot, the link for which is currently on the screen. it really helps us grow as a business and provide more events like this because, as I said, it's our first time running something like this. So we really appreciate the feedback to know what we should do next time to make it better, what we did well this time. And with that, we should have finished with everything. Thank you all once again for attending today. We really appreciate it because, as I said, it's our first event. So yeah, we were overrun a tiny bit by 5 minutes. So I would like to apologize for that. But we hope what you found today useful to you. Please feel free to leave the call if you'd like. But if you've got more questions, I'll be sticking around to answer them. Yeah, we at Edify Learning wish you the very best of luck with your UCAT. Yeah, please do not hesitate to get in contact. Thank you. So let's see. No worries, no worries. When can we get personal statement reviews? If we decide to write drafts over the summer, for instance, we're not planning, at least I don't think we're planning to do personal statement reviews explicitly. The only thing we've seen so far personal statement reviews are from the giveaway. But oh, actually, no, scrap what I just said. We are doing one-to-one consultations. So we're planning on releasing them or information about them in late August. And then we're planning on running them sometime in September before you actually apply on UCAS. So if you keep an eye out on our Instagram, on our website, we'll be releasing one of these. Yes, the consultations will be free. So we'll just be going through lots of applications with you, the different things you can apply to. So yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. No worries. No worries. Thank you for coming.
Ibshita, could you elaborate on what you're asking in terms of what would be free?
Oh, I think I was just talking about the personal statement consultation, but I think Nickson clarified that it was going to be.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm just going to clarify on what Nickson just said. So with the one-to-one consultations, what we'll actually be doing is that we're not actually doing personal statement reviews. So the only personal statement review we'll be doing is for the winner of the giveaway. So to clarify, what we would be doing in the one-to-one consultations is that to try and make sure you secure as many interviews as possible, we're just going to actually just be going through your pure stats. So what you get in UCAT, your GCSEs, your A-levels, and then compare it to the information we have on every specific university. So for example, let's use Oxford as an example. So Michael, one of the cohorts, one of the people, one of our fellow presenters, he's actually going to Oxford in October. So if you don't have around 10 A stars or 9 A stars, it is very unlikely for someone to actually get an Oxford interview. They'll most likely reject you pre-interview if you didn't have that number of A stars. So we'd be passing advice like that on to you. So like, let's say if someone with 2 A stars wanted to apply to Oxford, unless there were reasons why they didn't get any, unless there were extenuating factors or extenuating circumstances of why they didn't get 10 A stars, etc., that's when we'd be advising you where to apply, etc., so you can maximize the amount of interviews you get, if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, because I think, sorry to go off a bit, but I think what is actually, I think overhyped is that the importance of the personal statement. So the GMC actually don't rate personal statements that highly because they can easily be written by someone else or reviewed by someone else. So that's why they put more emphasis on entry exams. So very few unis actually look at the personal statement, and we make that very clear in our strategic ebook. And just to answer Tamid's question, so this probably won't make that much sense to you, but Imperial's cutoff for interview in sections 1 and 2 was 10.9, which was quite high this year. So the average is around 8 or 9 in the BMAT. So a score of 10.9 would easily secure you would secure you an Imperial interview, and it would also put you in good stead for an Oxbridge or Cambridge interview, as long as you've got good GCSEs to back that up. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Nickson.
That's fine, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, Tamid. That's exactly. But you'd also need to get 2.5C in section 3 as well. Okay, if there's any other questions, you can turn on your microphone and speak, or you can just type in the chat. Okay, I think we'll give 1 more minute or 2 more minutes for anyone to ask any more questions. Okay, just going to respond to your message. Since it's a cutoff, our interview's based on how high you score on your BMAT. Yes, for Imperial, that is the case. But the problem is that I'm expecting cutoffs to remain the same or increase because of what happened last year. Because when we were applying, there was a record number of applications and BMAT scores went off the charts. So yeah, interviews. So a simple answer to your question is yes, that is correct. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, so we're actually a very, very new company. So I think we started in June. So we don't actually have any ex-applicants who've gone through You Got Us. But however, what I would say is that not to diss any other companies, there are some really, really good companies out there. But I think what makes us special is our attention to detail. And I think, especially with me, I think what you'll get with me and my colleagues is that we just spit facts and we just spit what's the truth and what the stats actually tell us. Because I think what's different from, I think medicine admissions has actually changed quite a lot compared to how other companies look at medical admissions. Because with medicine, it's gotten a lot more competitive and their stats aren't up to date. So even if you have the best personal statement, the best reference, to many universities, it doesn't mean anything if you don't have the stats. And we've probably got that going for us. And we've actually been through the 2021 cycle, which was probably the hardest cycle there's ever been until 2022. Thank you for the kind words. Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, I think that's all for questions, unless I'm wrong. Okay, yeah, thank you for attending. It's been our pleasure. And thank you, Nickson and Michael, for hosting.
No worries.
Yeah, really well done, Nickson, there.
Thank you.
Fantastic job, guys. Well done.
Nickson, I mean, it's out for Nickson. You can end the recording.
Sure, I'll end the recording just now. If I can find how to end it, give a moment. There we go. It's recording.